All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today in person and online for our event on revamping the pharmaceutical supply chain, creating a reliable domestic supply. I'm Stephen Colville, and I lead the Revamped Drug Supply Chain Consortium at Duke-Margolis. And earlier today, we had our advisory group for the Revamped Consortium. And of course, beautiful planning, we had a fire drill. So just perfect timing with the 90-degree, 100-degree day in DC, perfect timing. But I was reflecting on that and how we probably all experienced a lot of fire drills in our lives. But many of us, and at least I haven't ever experienced a really serious actual fire before. Now, I'm not claiming any knowledge of fire prevention policy or anything like that, but perhaps there is just that, an emphasis on prevention, not firefighting itself, which is also important. So on the pharmaceutical supply chain front, unfortunately, disruptions and fighting the fire of the day is the norm. But transitioning to a preventive mindset can change that. What we can do right now, or what we do right now, is we ask healthcare providers to, on the fly, manage hundreds of shortages at any one time, which is a real challenge. But instead, I imagine a world where we prevent shortages from occurring in the first place. And we instead can focus on patient care and also on being able to have the luxury of running drills just to prepare for the potential scenario of maybe having a potential future shortage. But to achieve this, we need to revamp how our drug supply chain works. So we, both the public and private sectors in the US, are confronted with some major pharmaceutical supply chain challenges: chronic drug shortages, geopolitical and national health security risks, questions around pharmaceutical quality assurance, and a desire to grow local US economies and create high-paying manufacturing jobs. We can go to the next slide. Today's event will primarily focus on generic essential medicines. Next slide, please. Which sit at the intersection of many of these challenges that you can see. And our generic essential medicines are solving problems within those medicines are central to efforts to create a more reliable drug supply chain. So at our Revamp Consortium, next slide, please. We brought together a group of experts from across the supply chain that are all committed to these four tenets: a reliable drug supply that values availability. Low cost is important. We need to also value availability of critical generic drugs. Advanced and modernized manufacturing technologies, and the P within Revamp is our patient-centered focus and our patient-centered approach, which is why we're all here ultimately to take care of patients. So today we're first going to hear perspectives from senior HHS leaders on how they're working to confront these challenges. We'll also discuss what comes next for congressional action and our congressional spotlight, specifically focused on the Senate Aging Committee. And we'll then introduce our Duke-Margolis Framework to address chronic drug shortages, which synthesizes numerous Revamp Consortium publications into a comprehensive set of 6 priority areas outlining how the federal government can address chronic drug shortages. And we'll highlight the importance of coordination and setting specific goals related to domestic manufacturing. And we'll close by exploring what comes next for CMS payment policy efforts to support a more reliable and domestically sourced essential medicine supply chain, building off of their advance notice of proposed rulemaking from a couple months back. So quick housekeeping before I turn it over to Mark. We go to the next slide. Just a reminder of our statement of independence. Duke doesn't take partisan positions, but individual members and all of you here are free to speak your mind and share opinions on important issues. Looking at the lineup today, we're not going to have any issues with people sharing their opinions. There'll be lots of opinions shared here today. Next slide. Reminder for Zoom, please just type any issues you have in the Q&A or email margolisevents@duke.edu. And never fear, all the meeting materials will be available online afterwards. So with that, I will turn it over to our Institute Director, Mark McClellan, for some opening thoughts and then to introduce our leadership panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Stephen, thanks so much for that introduction. And I'm sorry not to be joining this important meeting in person today. The topic of reliable and sustainable supply of critical medications is a very important one, both for existing older medications, generic medications, and emerging ones. But greetings from North Carolina, where we are working closely with our state assembly on cost and access issues, including many related to the supply and availability of pharmaceuticals. And I want to give my thanks to all you for being there today to work on these important issues. Our advisory board members, both for their framework for addressing chronic drug shortages and for proving that they can make it weather a fire alarm drill, and also especially the very busy government officials who are working on a range of urgent issues. We appreciate you all taking the time for advancing policy reforms on this one, which has understandably been a high priority for the administration and Congress. To start the discussion, we'd like to consider the distinct but related pharmaceutical supply chain challenges that confront us today. Stephen talked about this. There are some major challenges, particularly relevant to older generic essential medicines. There have been some important policy progress, but more to do addressing chronic drug shortages, geopolitical and national security, or not national health security risks and concerns around pharmaceutical quality assurance. At the same time, there are many groundbreaking curative and near curative treatments entering the market or emerging that are using also advanced manufacturing techniques, including some newer techniques. But these new manufacturing methods don't have as much of a track record behind them, can be expensive, can contribute to high prices for new therapies, and also feed into these important questions about availability and security and sustainability of our supply chain. So this is a range of challenges. On the one hand, how can we ensure reliable, quality supply of older essential generic drugs, which tend to be manufactured more cheaply in the U.S. and compared to other high income countries, and also can benefit from more advanced manufacturing methods. And at the same time, how can we ensure that innovative curative therapies and the advanced manufacturing technologies used to make them are deployed in a manner that leads to reasonable costs, that keeps taking advantage of opportunities for continuous improvement, and can enable broader and more sustainable access to these therapies. And in both of these cases, we also want to assure U.S. Progress and competitiveness in manufacturing and biotechnology, particularly around issues related to national health security. So I'm glad to moderate this opening discussion with a group of leaders who've been thinking about these issues as well as many other related issues involving access, affordability of medications, and creating a stronger biomedical innovation foundation for the future. This includes, Alex Armanda, Principal Deputy Director of the Center for Medicare at CMS, Arlene Joyner, Director of the Center for Industrial-Based Management and Supply Chain at ASPR, and Brian Fahey, Associate Commissioner for Legislative Affairs at FDA. So thank you all very much for joining us there today. And I'd like to start with a question for each of you on your perspectives on the drivers and impacts of the most important challenges that confront us on these supply chain issues, particularly around older generic essential medicines. And maybe in the course of answering, you could also briefly introduce a little bit more about yourself and how you and your organization are working to address these challenges. Brian, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. You guys, yeah.
Yep.
Brian Fahey, Associate Commissioner for Legislative Affairs at FDA. My background is served almost a decade on Capitol Hill. Before Capitol Hill, worked in state politics in my home state of Delaware. Throughout my time on Capitol Hill, we faced this issue a number of times. Most namely, I think in July 2023, there was a drug shortage. I think it was a pediatric cancer drug at the time. And that consumed a lot of our bandwidth, trying to wrap our heads around what the appropriate amount of regulatory controls. Congress thought it would be necessary to address shortages. And then, zooming out even further, I think the challenge, obviously, not getting into Alex space, but reimbursement. I think that was a big concern of ours at the time, trying to sort of balance, on the regulatory side, what tools the FDA needed in addition to trying to sort of create the conditions for a more stable marketplace on the reimbursement side. So that's my background. I joined the FDA in July of last year. It's been an interesting 10 months, 11 months almost, to say the least. Last week was a quiet week for us at FDA. I think one of the things that we focused on over the past year, that was evidenced by one of the first executive orders President Trump signed, was reshoring and onshoring domestic manufacturing. What can we do to be more globally competitive? And what can we do to create the conditions here in the United States to strengthen our pharmaceutical supply chain? And one of the early steps that we took was creating this program. Think of it as TSA PreCheck. You guys might be familiar with the PreCheck program. It's two-phased. We in our early thinking and ideating, realized that over 50% of drug application denials are because of manufacturing issues and facility-based problems. And so we're trying to take a concerted effort to work with drug sponsors more quickly in the earlier stages as they're developing their manufacturing plans and also building their plants, most importantly, and connecting those early conversations to a drug master file. That way we can reference that in phase 2 of what this will ultimately look like, to make it easier for our reviewers to work with sponsors more seamlessly to identify any problems that have surfaced along the way. It's not a silver bullet by any means, but as you think about all the host of issues that drug manufacturers face and the supply chain faces, whether that be a natural disaster, a pandemic, any number of issues, you have to bulletproof, I think, your supply chain. You have to make it easier to get pharmaceutical manufacturing lines online as quickly as possible. So we're trying to think creatively. This PreCheck has mainly been driven by career staff at FDA that have seen at CDER that have seen these sort of one-off problems make it extraordinarily challenging to get drugs to market and facilities online. So that's one of the things that I think we're doing to try to be more nimble and quick to the punch without sacrificing safety and efficacy and undermining good manufacturing practices in the process. The second thing that we're focused on is trying to incentivize, and my colleague at Asper will probably share more about the great work that they're doing. But as you think about quality issues, as you think about trying to onshore here, you have to think about I guess in pharmaceutical, the terminology would be maybe natural resources, although APIs aren't necessarily natural resources. But we're trying to make it easier for or incentivize manufacturers to invest in U.S.-based API. We have a pilot program designed to do just that. It's kind of full throughput bioequivalent studies here in the U.S., finished dosage form in the U.S., and API sourcing fully U.S. In that case, you would get prioritized review for your ANDA. So those are two, I would say, medium-sized bites at the apple that we're trying to take. And then the second big challenge that we face, and we'll continue to face these challenges, but could certainly use the support of you on the room, are oversight, compliance, and inspections. It's absolutely critical that we streamline our efforts internally. it's no surprise that the different centers don't always talk to one another about various inspections and compliance efforts. And so we're really trying to reinvigorate internal discussions. They will be challenging, there's no question about it, because everyone at FDA is extraordinarily talented and has been there for a long time. They have a ton of institutional knowledge, but we need to find better ways to share, to exchange ideas, and simply information. Who's being assigned an inspection? Is that OII or is that CEDAR, and why? And once that inspection information, once we have that inspection information, is that being shared with the drug shortage staff? It's supposed to be by statute, but to what extent is that information actionable? So those are some of the steps that we're taking. Then, of course, forward unannounced inspections is going to remain a top priority for us at FDA.
Brian, thank you for the comments. I know it's a very busy time at FDA, but I appreciate all the efforts by the leadership there, the career staff there to move these important initiatives forward. So we'll come back to more on that. Arlene, Brian mentioned some of the work that ASPR is doing. Maybe we could turn to you next.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Again, I'm Arlene Joyner. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial-Based Management and Supply Chain within ASPR. And those that might not know ASPR is a relatively small operating division within HHS. And my group, IBMSC, is even smaller. And we are very new. We were created during COVID when there was a realization about a lot of supply chain issues in the medical field. Our medical products just weren't addressed from normal market fluctuations in supply and demand because all demand went up to population scale. So IBMSC was created and we focus a lot on supply chain and domestic manufacturing. So that's what my team, our big focus and our biggest focus in the last year or so and probably going forward is on critical medicines, APIs and KSMs, and helping to build the industrial base and help prevent drug shortages from that perspective, but also just ensuring that we have self-reliance and sustainability here in the U.S. I'm sure that this audience, I don't need to repeat how many APIs and KSMs are coming from overseas, and obviously concentrated from a couple countries that might not always have the same strategies as we do. So that makes us a little bit vulnerable from a national security perspective. Where we're coming from, ASPR as a whole is a response organization. So other parts of ASPR are doing things, I would say, more immediately, and they're pretty busy this last couple of weeks also with a little hantavirus and Ebola going on around the world. So a lot of my colleagues are addressing those. The work that we're doing is really more for preparedness, and again, that domestic manufacturing. I'll say from personal background, I had 21 years in large pharma manufacturing before I came to the government 15 years ago now. So I feel like I should retire soon. So I bring that industry experience, and actually, honestly, there are quite a few people within ASPR that do have, we really focus on bringing that experience in so that as we are partnering with companies to do domestic manufacturing, they kind of get some free consulting. They get some SMEs that really have had industry experience and can help guide them through kind of the whole life cycle. And that's especially important when we're working with small companies who have new technologies, and many of them have never commercialized a project or a product. So they're very different, and I think a lot of people in this audience also know, very different from those smaller manufacturers to the large pharma brand name. So a lot different skill sets. So I think that's where ASPR and IBMSC has become really helpful for those companies. So that's kind of what we do. We recognize, Mark, your question on what are the drivers for some of the issues. Obviously, low cost for generics, right? There's not a lot of profit margin going on there. So there's not a lot of huge incentives for new players to come into the market. And then also globally, we know there's the competition, and a lot of that is due to lower costs due to labor, but also there's other government subsidies that really don't level the playing field for our domestic manufacturers. So we are working with our partners on trying to help address that. So we have invested, I would say so far, close to $1 billion in the last 5 years for domestic manufacturing. And honestly, it's been, I would say, a little bit of a side note for IBMSC. Our bigger focus had been on PPE and the test kit program during Operation Warp Speed. As we had little bits of money come available, we started spending it on API domestic manufacturing, as that was acknowledged during the COVID response that some borders did close and we were kind of shut off from some of these medicines. So we spent about $1 billion. We have 14 performers that we're working with, have contracts with, and they are working on about 35 different APIs and KSMs. Many of you might know that we are also leading the effort on Executive Order 14336, which is the Strategic API Reserve, and stocking that with APIs. We look at that as a short-term solution for immediate need. Again, thinking of national security, if sources overseas were cut off, we would want to have a supply here in a stockpile API reserve perspective. But our long-term is the onshoring. It's really bringing that technology or new technologies or better technologies back to the U.S. So that's where our bigger focus going forward from a long-term is going to be working with those companies and helping them to become competitive with those global suppliers, because again, they have to be able to compete with cost, which is a big driver, I think, that's caused a lot of issues in the industry. So I will stop there for now.
Great. Thanks very much, Arlene. And now turn to Alec. Alec, good to see you again. So CMS is much larger than $1 billion agency and seems to have a critical role in all kinds of issues that affect population health and increasingly reliability of supply chains, even national security issues. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mark, and the Margolis team for having me. Thanks to my colleagues. A lot of what Arlene and Brian spoke about is in many ways so critical and upstream of a lot of what CMS does as a payer. We're following a lot of the activities, a lot of the important action that you all are taking and trying to think about that, synthesize it so that we can make hopefully smart payment policy. And as Mark mentioned, maybe just a quick briefer on the Center for Medicare, where I am. We have responsibility, as you can imagine, Medicare's parts A and B. There's one general group of folks who work on that, and a lot of that is payment rules, which you all may be familiar with. We have our fiscal year rules, we have our calendar year rules, and in fact, I know my colleague Ted here in the audience will be speaking much more in depth on our advanced notice for proposed rulemaking. So essentially kind of a precursor to potential proposed rulemaking that was issued earlier this year in January. And so he can speak a little bit more about that. But in general, the A and B side of the house, or original Medicare, as we call it, is a lot of the fiscal year, calendar year rulemaking, sometimes standalone rulemaking, where we do a lot of the administrative pricing, whether that's through, again, fee schedules or prospective payment systems. We also have we call them the C&D team, so the Medicare Advantage Part D side of the house. It's a completely different side of the brain, I think, that my colleagues in the Center for Medicare use, but more kind of, I think of it as kind of helping plans from an oversight perspective, but just kind of a lot of the processes that they have to work through to administer the benefits of private sector administered benefits. So with that context in mind, maybe what I'll do, well, actually, I'd also be remiss not to point out, I know with Arlene mentioning her private sector experience, I like Brian, Brian has a lot of experience as well, but we work together while on the Hill, and we have a really great, policy background with the folks with policy background in CMS, but we are actually in need of private sector expertise and help. I know Dr. Oz, if you hear him, very anytime in the last year, he is pleading, begging people, I'm looking around the room, people with the private sector experience, you have to come into government, even for a short spell, to, I think, share some of your market learnings and how we can, as a payer, incorporate those into our policies. Because what I'm about to suggest is, in the ANPR, as you may have noticed, they call them two basic categories of topics to solicit comment on. One being, having maybe some kind of a designation for hospitals if they were to procure a certain percentage of domestic supply, whether that be for PPE or essential medicines. And separately, there's within our colleagues in the Clinical Standards and Quality Group, CCSQ at CMS, they administer a lot of our quality programs. So one of those is a kind of a pay for performance program. And so there was, at least in the ANPR, we solicited comment for ways that we could, perhaps leverage the existing quality reporting structure to incentivize domestic supply issues. So with that in mind, I would say, learning from both, the drug shortage crisis that we went through in 2023, but also even prior to that during COVID, I think what it did is revealed some of the shortcomings with our payment system. I guess my hypothesis here is that I think a lot of what we're doing are important policies as far as reimbursement. If we were to kind of tweak this here, create the right incentive within a fee for service, a fee schedule or a payment system, yes, there may be some marginal impact. At the end of the day, a lot of that is frankly palliative care for a more endemic problem that we have in the fee for service program, where we still have call it thereabouts half the program in a fee for service chassis, which it doesn't have the built-in incentives for accountability. If you think about from a managed care standpoint, so having accountable relationships, whether that be Medicare Advantage plans or ACOs, they have more of a longitudinal focus on patients. They're more of a long-term relationship. So that just think of the example, if you're a managed plan, you're an ACO or you're a managed care plan, and you have an incentive and you're paid based off of the outcomes, whether it's a hospital readmission, or the downstream consequences of a decision. If there's a drug shortage on the horizon, there's actually, if you set the contours right, there is an incentive to perhaps, there's incentive to maybe procure products that would, you would be hedging against potentially a drug shortage or other disruptions. So I think my point being, I think if we can think critically about the levers that we have to encourage people to go into accountable care relationships, we'll have more built-in incentives to reward investments from a reimbursement side into more durable domestic supply. So that's a part of what I think would, just to put that out there to think about what we're doing in CMS. Again, we have our proposed our ANPRM out there, looking ahead to our calendar year rulemaking cycle. I also think like what we're doing to encourage accountable care. That means things like in our physician fee schedule, using more empirically reliable sources of data. Oftentimes, as many physicians will point out, the way that we pay physicians is based off of often surveys conducted by a medical society that has an interest in how they're paid. I think to use more empirically reliable, objective data sources, that as we start to turn the ship in that direction, that will allow for us to better reflect the market realities and some of the disruptions we have for our domestic supply for PPE and other essential medicines. So, Mark, there's some scattered thoughts to get us going.
Well, I think very scattered at all actually leads to my next question. You're just talking about, Alec, this kind of cross-cutting theme at CMS around getting to accountability for what really makes the health of beneficiaries and in some cases the whole U.S. population better. Medicare has such a system-wide influence, and thinking about sort of reliable sources of drugs. You mentioned the shortages, say, of cancer, some critical cancer generic injectables over the last few years. That is a safety issue. That is a quality issue for hospitals that are delivering care to cancer patients, and I think does fit in with the broader challenges here. But that leads me to the next question, which is, as you all have just made clear, these issues around reliable supply aren't ones that any one agency in HHS or any one piece of government can solve on its own. It'd be good to hear from each of you about how you're working across agencies on these issues to help maximize impact. And if you don't mind, any challenges or opportunities, maybe put it that way, for the kind of work that the Revamp Consortium is doing, trying to bring together, as we often do, Duke-Margolis, a range of different perspectives that share a common interest, but may not have that as much connective tissue and aligned support as we'd like. How's it going on coordinating the response and the further steps on getting to more reliable, secure, sustainable, efficient drug supply for critical medicines? And anything you'd like to highlight as to how the revamp group could help? And maybe Brian, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing I didn't mention actually, I know it was referenced in the opening comments. I was just reading through a report, and in 2011 there were 251 drugs in shortage. There were 4 drugs in shortage in 2025. We prevented at FDA 330 drug shortages. So I think we've come a pretty long way in addressing some of the systemic issues, but of course we have our work cut out for us. I'm not saying that our work is done by any means. But I just kind of getting into where I left off my previous comments about inspections, compliance, really understanding where we're getting our medicines. There's been a ton of conversation. I've been party to a lot of these conversations with lawmakers on the Hill, particularly the Senate Aging Committee. There's lots of concerns on supply chain mapping. What does that look like? How much information is too much information? Both for, I think policymakers at FDA, regulators, ASPR, CMS, and then, importantly for consumers, because, I think there's an increased interest for good reason to give, people greater visibility into what they're putting in their bodies and where it's coming from. So, I think country of origin labeling is one that I know Senator Scott has discussed, and there are a handful of other members who have interest in the issue. And then, I think as a part of the sort of the broader America First agenda and trying to prioritize U.S.-based manufacturing and drug development, supply chain mapping. And that's, I think in the procurement side, which I'll let Asper get into more, but I think, at FDA, what we're trying to do is really drill down on how much information we can extract from pharmaceutical manufacturers and then share it across the government. DOW has had big interest here, obviously for security purposes and in war zones and making sure that our war fighters are, the medicines they're, putting into their bodies are safe. And then, Asper too on the contracting procurement side. So I think that the challenge, Mark, as you put it, because I think, it's easy to identify a problem. We're working through the solutions, but I would say one of the big challenges for us as we are trying to do, supply chain mapping is this question of confidential commercial information. We can't, we are prohibited by law to carte blanche share proprietary information. Manufacturers' proprietary information. And so I think that's that remains an unanswered question, how we, solve for that part of the problem. But we're committed to it because, we understand how important it is as we try to incentivize government agencies to invest in American made pharmaceuticals. The second, thing I would say that is not directly related to coordination, but I think one thing that we've tried to do a better job of is holding firms accountable, warning letters, etc. And that's obviously information that is publicly available. We can share that. And I think the more information that we can share on a timely basis is critical. As our government partners are making decisions, multi-million dollar, in some cases billion-dollar decisions on pharmaceutical contracts. So that's one that we've worked on, and then through the we put out a couple of legislative proposals that would make it easier to hold people accountable if they're sharing information with us that is would indicate that a drug is misbranded or there are some issues with with the manufacturing. I think we're trying to do as much as we can to get our own house in order and equip ourselves with data that we need to be able to share that. But the question that remains unanswered is, how do we address the CCI concerns? And welcome input from anyone in the room that has thoughts there. But I think once that question is answered, it's going to enable us to partner in a meaningful way with industry across the healthcare supply chain to both bring back manufacturing to the U.S., but more importantly, protect patients.
Yeah, thank you. It does seem like better information, much of which is held in the private sector, maybe burdensome or create CCI issues to share. So getting some more public-private collaboration, improve the information that everybody's using to implement these and coordinate these policies seems like a good idea. And maybe if specific details are an issue, maybe at least information on security risks that might be associated with some APIs or other components in the supply chain is worth pursuing. I hope we can come back to that topic later today. Arlene, you already talked about how you just the nature of ASPR. You have to do a lot of coordination. Any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah. I think we've been really lucky. I'll say lucky, but this problem, this issue has been highlighted quite a bit, I'll say in the last year or so. And I always, we get a lot of attention on critical medicines. So we're interacting with really almost every other government agency. So we are in active discussions with Department of War's Health Affairs, DLA, State Department, Commerce Department, Veterans Affairs, the multiple White House councils, Made in America office. So there's a lot of interest, which I see that as a good thing. It gives me a lot of homework usually, a lot of tasks to do. But attention is good. And then, that's how changes can come about, is there's a lot of discussion. I would say over the last 5 years, there's been kind of low level rumbling about it, shortages and domestic manufacturing being a gap or a national security issue. Now it's risen to the point where I think there's more interest of all the different agencies to become involved and see where they have a stake in resolving the issue. So I think I see that as a good thing. There's a lot of work that's being done to coordinate, because honestly, HHS doesn't have as much funds as sometimes Commerce and DOW, and they're coming to us saying, hey, we've got a lot of funding that's coming through. It's supposed to be focusing on pharmaceuticals. HHS, you guys are the experts. How can we partner so we can, use the funds as most efficiently as possible? So I think that's it's a great sign that we're moving in the right direction. So that coordination, I think, we'll continue to do. But we are government, so it's a lot of work to get everyone on the same page. And I think the first challenge that we've been encountering is just learning what each of the different agencies' needs are, because they're not all the same, and also what are they already doing in this space. So fortunately for us, I know ASPR, we've been doing quite a bit in terms of funding domestic manufacturing companies, but we're not, we weren't sure what exactly is DOW doing in this space, or what is Commerce doing. So I think our first challenge is actually just getting that understanding of what each group is working on, and then coordinating, all right, so how can we align all those efforts and funding that you have so that we're all each meeting missions that support, each of the different agencies. So I'm real excited to know that there's a lot more discussions happening now when they weren't happening before. So it's also not a quick, easy answer, but I feel like we're going in the right direction. So the coordination is happening, and I think it will continue to get better.
Yeah, thanks very much. Alec, I know Ted's will probably have more to say about some of these coordination issues since he's
Sure will.
deeply involved in many of them. But any kind of high level thoughts? It does seem like, CMS partnerships with FDA seem to be expanding and, building off the public health emergencies. I know there's been some closer tie-ins with ASPR and other parts of HHS as well on security issues like this.
That's right, Mark. I would say first at a high level agreement, I think with both what Brian and Arlene mentioned about, I think a lot of the progress has been made and a lot of the coordination that's occurred in recent years. I go back to my time in CMS during the PHE, and yes, there's a lot of late nights with colleagues in the organizations reflected here and CDC and others as well. So I think a lot of that kind of infrastructure has persisted in a good way. So that collaborations continue. I would also agree with that progress in mind that Brian mentioned at a macro level, there's still to kind of take it a level deeper at the kind of micro level among, especially like in rural underserved parts of the country, we still have a lot of hospitals in particular. I know there's a survey, it's a little bit dated now, but like two-thirds, just a little under two-thirds of hospitals reported drug shortages, upwards of 20 different drug shortages at a given time. So I think the point being that there's still, at a micro level, there are still communities that are facing some significant access challenges. So with that in mind, one thing I would to beat the dead horse a little bit on the kind of moving towards accountable relationships and how that's a predicate for anything that if we're going to be able to address on the reimbursement side, that's the predicate for any of these ideas to really, I think, take off. One point on the kind of coordination, both internally within HHS with our colleagues at ONC and ASTP on the kind of the data flow among patients as they're traveling, that we call interoperability. As interoperability hopefully takes root and becomes table stakes, and we build on that over time. That will allow for, I think, more for these accountable relationships to then be able to do more demand forecasting, which again, fee for service does not lend itself to be able to do. So I think if we can get the data exchange, data flowing, and then you have the people moving towards accountable relationships, that will, I think, alleviate a lot of the problems that we're talking about. So I think that occurs with greater coordination internally at HHS to make sure that the data is flowing.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into my time for we have about 6, 7 minutes left. So this will be, I think, the last question we'll be able to get to. Some great discussion. I want to focus in on since a lot of the discussion today is about those essential generics that have been prone to shortage. You all talked about a lot of progress in reducing shortages, but it still, as Alex said, comes up with specific organizations, specific places. And from the CMS standpoint, the way I see the agency on sort of upstream issues like this is that they're sort of pull incentives, and it's one thing to just pay a hospital a little bit to administer a drug. It's another thing to pay for, like Alec was saying, accountability. Not just can you deliver that drug today, but do you have a reliable supply and efficient supply. We want low cost too, that'll assure that it's going to be there. And that's where, action by CMS can help advance some downstream, some upstream activities around, well, I need to find a supplier now that can demonstrate they're reliable, and if there are national security issues involved, that they've got a secure source of supply that won't be disrupted by potential emergencies, public health or otherwise. So for this last question, just any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with on important further steps, especially that this group could help inform and advance related to reliable, sustained, efficient availability, robust global security challenges of critical drugs, particularly critical generic drugs over time. And let's just stick with the same order, Brian.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I'll try to be brief here. I think one thing that I did mention in my last response was the coordination that we do with our international partners at FDA. That plays a huge role in how we're monitoring the drug supply chain.
Yeah.
We have MRA agreements, mutual recognition agreements that make it more possible for foreign governments to inspect pharmaceutical manufacturers within their borders. That makes it easier for us to allocate resources to riskier areas or high risk parts of the world, China, India, anywhere else. So I think that's one thing that we're going to continue to try to do. And then, obviously, it's not directly related to drug shortages. It's more sort of more at the macro level. But phase one clinical trial reforms. I mean, China's the secretary said it during the budget hearings. Hopefully, you all don't live on Twitter as much as I do, but it was reverberating Twitter feverishly. But China's eating her lunch on clinical trial starts. I think 50% of novel drugs that were approved last year, I think 50% of them were licensed out of China. The trial started in China. So I think if we bring back more domestic manufacturing of generic drugs, in addition to incentivizing firms to start trials here in the U.S., making it easier to do that, hopefully long term we'll have a more comprehensive pharmaceutical life science supply chain here in the U.S. So I would say that's in addition to PreCheck, the ANDA pilot, and a number of the other issues I discussed. I mean that's a top priority for us at FDA this year.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate all the work that's going on at FDA, and Grace Graham as well is involved in making sure you all are staying involved in these international regulatory public health monitoring, alignment where possible, particularly with allies to improve that global evidence base. It's so important. Arlene?
Yeah, domestic manufacturing and being as efficient as possible is a big part of what we do at ASPR. I will say though, focusing on the end-to-end life cycle is really important. We used to have a philosophy earlier on, like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. Well, that doesn't happen, as many of you may know also, or know of other companies where they built it and nobody came. So it's real important from our perspective. We're investing millions of taxpayer dollars to continue on the last steps of that, and that is helping the companies get to FDA approvals and then commercialization, and then connecting them with the demand, right, with the customers. And I will say industry has come to us repeatedly saying that is the biggest thing that would help them is to provide demand. So many ask for government contracts. But for critical medicines, honestly, ASPR is not a big buyer for medicines. Your VA might be one of the big ones. Indian Health, DOW might be for big purchases as well. But that's not something ASPR can do. And quite honestly, we don't want our partners that we invest in to be solely reliable on government as a customer as well. So we see this as not just a whole of government, but a whole of nation issue. So we are working again with other agencies. There's other levers that need to be put in place to help sustain these companies that we're investing in. We want them to be here and capable, and their capabilities enduring for years to come. So CMS, the rulemaking is one, that reimbursement, but there's also options or possible ways to reimburse the manufacturers for the difference between a lower price here and that competition with global suppliers. There's tariffs, there's tax incentives. So we are talking with a lot of other agencies and seeing what can be done to support, again, our domestic manufacturers. So again, it's not an easy problem to solve, and those answers and those ideas are not easy to implement either. But again, we're having those discussions, and we're getting good reception from other agencies on how can we help and how can we make this happen, because there is recognition this is a national security issue. So I think that's a positive going forward. So those are the types of things that we're doing to help the domestic manufacturing in the industrial base.
Thanks. And Alec, you already talked about some steps CMS has taken in its payment rules. But again, with that focus on accountability for better, more reliable results and lower costs, you also got to pay attention to efficiency and reliability, not just domestic issues. Anything you'd like to add at this point on the topic?
Thanks, Mark. I'll be brief and just I think to try to as stewards of well over $1 trillion a year Medicare program, I think there's an element of being, I think, prudent with how we go about this, knowing that, That's why we put out the ANVRM. And I would also mention, if you were here, I'd make sure Abe Sutton, who's our Innovation Center Director, to the extent we can, if there are tests, if there's, as we're moving towards more accountable care, as we're using what's called the MSSP, our Shared Savings Program, or the Innovation Center testing models to move people into accountable relationships, if there are levers or are there incentives that are appropriate, that again, ideally in a budget neutral fashion or even savings, I think the extent you can capture some of the downstream impacts and some of that modeling. I think to get to one, I think your initial question, Mark, on what I think the audience could do is help us kind of some of that idea generation within that kind of balancing the stewardship that we need to, we have to keep, there's scorekeepers who keep us accountable. But also I think again, the patient access, I think that again, with an accountable relationship, the incentives are there. We just want to make sure we can configure it in a way that patients ultimately benefit. That's all I'd say. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, and thank you, and thanks for again mentioning the RFI, and that is something that I think the revamp group is trying to pull together some analysis and thoughtful comments on, and keeping your mission in mind of accomplishing these population health goals, doing as efficiently as possible, and trying to move to shared accountability and all the supports, better information sharing, aligned incentives that come with that. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of what I know are really busy schedules right now to have this excellent kickoff discussion. We appreciate your ongoing engagement with our team at Duke-Margolis, not only on these critical supply chain issues, but on a lot of other topics related to preparedness, emergency preparedness and response, and to biomedical innovation and high value care delivery. Thank you all very much for being with us today. And we're now going to turn to the next session on the program, back to Stephen to discuss what's coming next. We heard a little bit of reference to the Senate Aging Committee's efforts, and very glad to be joined by Claire Descamps as a part of this effort. Stephen and Claire.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to Alec and Arlene and Brian for sharing their perspectives with us. Very excited to be joined by Claire Descamps, Staff Director for Ranking Member Gillibrand at the U.S. Senate Aging Committee. So I'm sure many in our audience have noticed over the past year that the Aging Committee has taken a significant interest in this topic, with several hearings held and some draft legislation that's resulted from those hearings. So I'll just start off by asking if you could just describe the importance of these issues for seniors, and what have your biggest takeaways been from what you've learned over the past year? And if you could just introduce yourself in that response as well, that'd be great.
Of course. So Claire Descamps, I'm the staff director for Ranking Member Gillibrand on the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging. Aging Committee, I feel like traditionally has maybe flown a little bit under the radar in this space, but we've really taken an interest, as Stephen has said, in this issue this past Congress. It's been absolutely wonderful working with Chairman Scott's team on a really diverse range of issues that we traditionally haven't talked about. The Aging Committee, for those who aren't super familiar, we're a non-legislative committee within the Senate, meaning we just don't get markups, we don't get nominations referred to us, but we are still a full committee that is able to explore any issue that is related to older adults, which is quite broad, which is why we have really focused on this topic. I think we've had 4 or 5 hearings on this issue. We're gonna have a few more. I see people in the audience that have helped us with learning background, with technical assistance, with witnesses. So very much appreciate everyone who's kind of stepped up to give us some background in this space. So nearly every adult, older adult, is taking some form of medication. 88% of adults 65 and over are taking at least one. That number gets even higher when you're looking at the age bracket of 75 to 84. That's about 91%. The reason this is so important to seniors is they're the ones who are interfacing with the health system the most. They're the ones who are taking the most medication. They're the ones who are going to the doctor the most. They potentially have the most complex health issues, and they tend to be more at risk when it comes to drug shortages. We can see delays in care because of shortages, specifically oncology drugs. You can also see hospitals buying large amounts of medication in times of shortages. And that can potentially leave our smaller or more rural hospitals at a greater disadvantage. I think one of the times that this really first came to the forefront of our radar was when there were oncology drug shortages in New York, but we weren't hearing about downstate, we were hearing about upstate, we were hearing about the North Country, we were hearing about Western New York, who these hospital systems may not necessarily have as much purchasing power as our larger hospitals downstate. I think one of the biggest takeaways that we've really learned from our several hearings is that market concentration really is a big issue in this space. More shortages are occurring with generics that have 3 or few manufacturers, but there's also the market concentration in the purchasers as well. This also will lead to, if there are shortages, more money being spent on brand name drugs when the generics are not available. As we all well know here that there is very low margins in the generic space. It leads to kind of the classic refrain of the race to the bottom that we always say. And because of this extreme price erosion, the lowest price drugs are usually the ones that are at the highest risk of a shortage. So while we do consider all of our different options as we think of potential legislation, still one of the biggest things at the forefront of our mind, if not the biggest thing, is to keep our drugs affordable for seniors. And then lastly, one of the things that I feel like has come up a lot are issues with FDA inspections. And what I mean by that, it's more, we need more support for our foreign inspectors. We need more support for this agency to hire this staff. It is not an easy job. You're traveling a lot. You're potentially dropped into an area with not as potentially much support. And we, I think, have really focused on, or try to focus on, the need to support that agency a lot, because the fact of the matter is right now we don't have that much manufacturing or production in the United States. So we need to make sure that while we start our reshoring process, that we are supporting the folks that are doing that really, really important work abroad.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And the hearings have focused a lot on geopolitical risks and questions around quality assurance, which are of course really important issues. And so there's been a focus on identifying where drugs are made and what that might mean. But just curious, how do you see those issues of geopolitical risk and quality assurance issues intersecting with other important drug supply chain issues too? Are other things that we need to consider along with just identifying location of production?
Yeah, I mean, look, if we're concentrating our drug production too much anywhere, it's a risk. It doesn't matter if it's just Asia or whether it's Europe, whether it's Canada. We can see what happened after Hurricane Helene with the Baxter facility that produced about 60% of our IV fluid. If we concentrate too much in any one location, we are putting ourselves at a risk for potential natural disaster or a geopolitical conflict. What it also really means is that we need better risk management plans, in addition to kind of reforming the industry at large. Because if we are required to sole source on something, what happens if there is a conflict? Like, we need to really be thinking forward on what do we do if there is, or when there is, unfortunately, another situation like a pandemic. But just because something is made somewhere, whether that's China, whether that's India, that doesn't inherently mean it is dangerous or that it is bad for us. At the same time, though, we do need to do more testing. We really need to make sure that the things that are coming to the United States are safe. We want to make sure that folks aren't afraid of taking their medications just because of the country of origin. But we do want to make sure that the supply chain is safe, and whether that means moving towards a model similar to a qualified person in the EU, who right now we aren't close to that, but just as an example, But in addition, right now, purchasers aren't really incentivized to focus on anything but cost right now. We need to incentivize purchasers to think about reliability, diversity in their supply chain. But we also really want to focus on, when it comes to the geopolitical risk or lowering the geopolitical risk, focus on innovation based in the United States. As mentioned in the previous panel, China is really gaining an edge on us when it comes to emerging biotechnology and biopharmaceutical innovation. And although here we are very focused on generics, and as the Aging Committee hearings have very much been focused on generics, when we talk about geopolitical risks and how to prepare for them, we also need to think about the technology that will be coming in the future, and how to make sure that we don't fall behind in this innovative sector, and while we still try to shore up what we currently have here.
Absolutely. And Thomas and Maddie on our team in the back are probably going to roll their eyes at me because they hear me say this all the time. But one thing that I like to say is we need to do two things. One is measure, and the second is incentivize the right thing once we can measure. So you talked to measurement a little bit, and also a need for different incentives for purchasers. So curious if you could speak to the Clear Labels Act that was introduced by Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Gillibrand recently. And that would require prescription drug labeling information to disclose the original manufacturer site locations for finished drug products and APIs. And so what might the value be of providing that additional level of transparency? There's obviously other pieces of information that are critical as well, besides just location of manufacturing. But what's the value, and what benefits and limitations do you see?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, we want to know where our drugs are coming from. Consumers also, we've heard, want to know that you know where your clothes are coming from, you know where your meat most of the time is coming from. So consumers do want to know where their drugs are being produced. The language that's on the bottle can sometimes be a little bit confusing. There's a whole menagerie of words that are used: manufactured for, manufactured by, produced for, produced in, can be a little bit confusing. And then we also think the way that the Clear Labels Act is currently written, it makes it easier if there is a change in production location or facility. It's easier to update things when it's on a website versus having to reprint a label. We also think it would help we can find where kind of the choke points are when you really are going up. Although it does get difficult at a certain layer of finding really where something is exactly from, but that will help us find where choke points are and where we need to diversify in the future. But this is not the end all be all of legislation. Just because people know where something is from does not mean they're necessarily going to change their purchasing habits. They may not necessarily be able to change their purchasing. So if you go to CVS, they may only have one type of generic drug. Your insurance company may not cover a brand name if a generic is available. So this is just, I think, the first step in what we hope to be a very comprehensive reform, the Clear Labels Act. I think the easiest place in bipartisanship to start is transparency. Once you kind of get a lay of the land a little bit better, you're really able out where you go next. You can't figure out where the choke points are unless you can see them. But we're not doing this just to make people, not that anyone would think that we're doing this, but it's not just to say, oh my gosh, my drug is coming from China, I don't want to take it. We do really want to stress that by and large, the generics that folks are taking right now are safe. But this is the first step into creating a more reliable supply chain. We've had obviously several hearings on this. This is, I think, one of the easiest steps that spurred a lot of curiosity and conversations with committees that are with members that are on the committee, off the committee. We've seen a lot of different bills getting considered or written, and it's been really exciting. And we are I'm looking forward to working with the chairman's team as well as other folks in the Senate and in the House to figure out what is a good way to really get our teeth into addressing drug supply shortages and quality issues. This is one of those topics that it's such like a long-term project by Congress that sometimes, or the Senate, that sometimes things will come up and you get a little bit sidetracked. And whether it's I think fourth Votorama that we have this year, like we sometimes get a little distracted from our long-term goals because of the short term. But this is something that I think we are really settling into for kind of the long haul. We know it will take several Congresses to really make meaningful change, but that is not something that we are afraid to do.
Absolutely. And, that if the Clear Labels Act was passed and implemented, I could imagine a lot of really interesting, from an academic research perspective, like I could imagine a lot of interesting use cases for that information. I can think of some other use cases too. I don't really envision patients at the pharmacy counter necessarily reacting to that information all that much. Like, are people really going to ask for, Chairman Scott says he will, which I definitely believe he will. But I don't know if people will actually go and say, oh, I don't want that drug because it's made here.
I've definitely started looking at my prescription. I'm like, where's this from?
Right. But I don't know, I don't know if that's going to happen too much. I also don't know if medication adherence, some people bring up medication adherence issues.
I like that ringtone.
Yeah, it is nice. We're going into our siesta. So for medication adherence, that could be a concern where people might not want to take the medicine. Again, I don't personally know if that would happen all that much. So how do we take this concept, which gives some useful information, and take it to the next level, have it be implemented, or have it factor into decisions, or maybe that requires some larger structural incentive changes, including probably some things that would result in some short-term spending. But what do you see as what comes next beyond the Clear Labels Act?
Yeah, I think when I hear just the phrase, if we have transparency, the market will right itself. That's not necessarily, it's a good first step, but it's not necessarily going to completely turn the ship just because we know where things are from. I agree with you that potentially medication adherence is not a huge concern that we have heard a lot. I know when you came to testify at our committee, all of it, you guys are way more the experts than we are. Everyone went down the line. If this was the only drug available, would you take it? And everyone said yes. Because if this is the only drug available, we recommend you take it. But as I said before, we really need to create more incentives for purchasers to consider resilience and reliability. That may be how we do maybe longer term contracting. We'll have manufacturers plan better for sourcing or supply lines. But it also isn't only on manufacturers. We do have a lot of consolidations in other parts of this purchasing chain. We are far from doing legislation in that space, though, just so no one gets too nervous. But we really do need to. We see this as a good beginning. We've worked obviously with your team a lot on potentially looking at legislation regarding supply chain mapping, regarding benchmarking, regarding pilot programs. We're still obviously in the process of what does that look like. We have definitely gotten some interest from some of our colleagues across the aisle, which is obviously very exciting. But honestly, we need more incentives also for our more upstream upstream ingredients to be made here domestically. API, KSM. We've obviously talked with some really great companies that have come to either testify or just given us background that are making things in the United States. And we kind of see the role of what government needs to play is it needs to be a public-private partnership. Obviously, this is too big of a problem for the government to solve, nor should it be just on us. But we're very excited to work with our industry partners to figure out what is the best way forward to really ensure that we're doing this right. For us, it is very much, as I said, it's about passing something that's meaningful and passing something that's helpful. We don't want to just write bills and have hearings just to say that we did it. We want to do it so that we can change things. But I think we've done a good job at, if I do say so myself, for the Aging Committee, done a good job of really like bringing this conversation to the consistent forefront at the Senate. So we are I think the next step is just going to be the incentives on reliability and resiliency. Transparency is wonderful, but it needs to be coupled with an actual push.
Right. So in terms of that push, it's a multi-pronged thing, I would think. So what do you envision being covered in future Senate aging discussions versus maybe other committees or outside? You know, what could the folks here representing all other sectors of the industry be doing as well?
Yeah, obviously the Senate Finance Committee a few years ago came out with their white paper to address chronic drug shortages, which we thought was very, very great. We've worked with them closely as we've started getting background for the hearings. For us, we have, I believe, a few more plans for this year. We have at least 2 in June. The names of the hearings right now are escaping me, but it will be
maybe TBD as well.
Yeah, maybe you never know what's going to get thrown into hearing preparation. Their schedule, I'm very glad I'm not a scheduler. That seems like an extremely difficult job on the Hill. But we are going to be doing more. We're going to be doing at least 2 more hearings this year, probably more. We have a lot of time. Well, it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but a few weeks left of session for the rest of the year before everyone is off for midterm season. But I would love to talk to anyone here after or set up any discussions on any thoughts for future hearings or any ideas for legislation. Stephen and his team obviously know I am not shy about reaching out. So be warned, if you offer assistance, I will be calling you. But we're really excited to see what kind of comes next and see what other members are thinking of. There's always the opportunity for, I know folks are considering things in the NDAA, although I have heard, please don't just saddle DOD with everything. We're like, okay, that's fair enough. NDAA is the one that moves the most, but we understand. So we're just excited to work with our different agency partners as well. Worked closely with FDA with the Clear Labels Act, and just really looking forward to seeing what the ranking member and chairman kind of decide to do moving forward.
Looking forward to that as well. One last quick question, just around the scale of the problem. So Chan Harjivan, visiting fellow at Duke-Margolis, one thing he always says is that it's a relatively easy problem to solve. I think what he means by that is it's like, you know, you can make a big difference here in the hundreds of millions of range in terms of incentives if you target it to the highest priority drugs. So when we're thinking about those incentives, is there a way to get traction on some near-term steps, given that it is really a solvable problem compared to some other problems that, you know, are billions, or I've heard the trillion word thrown out.
I think if you focus on the essential medicines first, there are many lists out there of what is an essential medicine, obviously. So we would have to be very specific on what that means, but it would probably just mean the medicines that are ones used most in our healthcare settings that are most chronically in shortage. It will definitely, the unfortunate thing, it will definitely cost money, but that's what's going to kind of have to happen. The hundreds of millions is certainly a lot easier of a sell than billions or trillions. So I think if we have a small step forward, seeing if there is some sort of pilot we can do with a very narrow list of medicines, see how that works. If we see that there is a really big difference, if we see a big improvement in we see positive reactions from the manufacturing community, purchasing community of, okay, I'm able to plan better because I know I have a reliable buyer, or I know that I will be, if I go that little bit extra mile, that few more cents, few more dollars, that I will get something in return. And I think if we work on legislation like that, I know you guys have proposals out there that we are definitely interested in exploring with you. I think that will be a really meaningful way to actually push things forward with some momentum. And I think would be a great place for all of us to work together. Great place for Congress to kind of really get involved in a chronic problem that is affecting not just seniors, even though that's what we focus on in the aging committee, but something that affects everybody. So we are really looking forward to seeing what that looks like and to ideally passing a bill. I mean, not that much time left in the 119th, but maybe 120th, maybe 121st, but we'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. We really appreciate your time and your leadership on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So switching seats here slightly, but really looking forward to this awesome group that we have here to talk through our next panel. But before we get to our panel, I'd like to just really quickly take a moment to introduce our Duke-Margolis Revamped Drug Supply Chain Consortium's framework to address chronic drug shortages that I mentioned earlier. So if we go to the next slide, we're now in our fourth year working with our consortium members to generate policy solutions to help patients ultimately have better access to drugs by reducing the frequency and severity of chronic drug shortages. So our framework synthesizes major recommendations that we've been working on with many of our revamped members for several years. Synthesizes recommendations into these priority areas to form a comprehensive vision for policy action to address chronic drug shortages. So for everyone in person, you should have a QR code on your agenda. You can check this out. So I'll quickly, very briefly touch on the 6 areas of the framework. We go to the next slide. So first is federal coordination. So we proposed HHS create a coordinating mechanism to set concrete and measurable objectives on supply chains and serve as a nexus for HHS supply chain expertise. Next slide. Supply chain measurement. So here we recommended that Congress direct CMS along in partnership with other agencies to authorize an independently led drug supply chain reliability assessment program that would differentiate manufacturers of the same generic drug based on their reliability. Next slide. CMS payment reforms to prevent drug shortages that we've talked to in several of the panels today. So we proposed next steps for both the Senate Finance proposal on a Medicare payment program to prevent shortages, as well as next steps for the CMS RFI that we'll talk to in an upcoming panel, and how those could create meaningful incentives. Next slide. We've also talked about various advanced and modernized manufacturing technologies, how some new FDA programs can help those take off, and also how other supply side incentives are needed, especially to apply these to critical generic categories. Next. Addressing geopolitical risk in the supply chain, not using a one-size-fits-all approach, but targeting policy interventions to specific vulnerable product categories and using different levers as appropriate based on those different product categories. And then lastly, leveraging international collaboration, both through regulatory harmonization efforts across partner governments and economic partnership efforts across partner governments that are aligned with U.S. interests, with important safeguards in place for national health security. So we're fortunate to have had such great input from many of you in developing this framework, and we have a great panel here that all is working in different areas, touching on different topics that are very relevant to this framework. So we're really excited to get into our discussion. So Just to introduce everyone briefly, we have first Alan Cockle from Civic RX, Tori Mack from Children's Hospital Association, Brooke Courtney from FDA, and Anthony Lukavich from US Pharmacopoeia. So, in my first question here, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself a little bit more too. But maybe Alan, perhaps I'll start with you. So in the framework I just overviewed, that requires different actors across the supply chain to work in concert towards common goals related to addressing shortages. So could you describe your organization's role in a comprehensive like this? Where does Civica fit in best? And what barriers are there to realizing the vision that we've put forth in the framework?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And congratulations on publishing the framework to you and your colleagues. I think it's a really useful structure that pulls together a lot of years of good work in this field. So congratulations on that. Maybe I'll just start with one of the things that I think is one of the truest and most important things ever said, which is that every system is perfectly designed to produce the exact results that it produces. And that's really relevant. We heard in the first panel today that the number of new drug shortages last year was down a little bit. And that's encouraging. That's good news. And it seems to be a real decline. But I talked to Michael Gagno from ASHP, who's in the back. The number of ongoing drug shortages is still 200 drugs at any given time. And the system hasn't changed. So while a downtick last year in new shortages is encouraging, there's no reason to believe this problem has been resolved. Okay. Civica is a nonprofit drug manufacturer that was formed by health systems really to say, this system's not self-correcting. What can we do to have a different business model that responds to drug shortages? And so Civica is a bunch of health systems, 60 now, 1,400 hospitals around the country coming together. They're prioritizing products that are in shortage or at high risk of shortage. And then we're running kind of a different model for delivering drugs, mostly sterile injectable drugs, because that's mostly what's in shortage. And that model is built on committed volume contracts, real rigor and robust quality oversight in sourcing with a preference for domestic sourcing whenever possible, and maintenance of a 6-month targeted buffer inventory for every drug that we supply. We actually just crossed an important milestone this week, which is 100 million patients served since our inception about 8 years ago. And so it's a model that I think has a lot of coherence with what's in the revamped framework. There are challenges, and one of them, as we've heard today, is that the incentives in the system are still to buy the cheapest drug on any given day. And as long as that happens, we'll push production to low-cost environments, and we'll push production to companies that cut corners on quality. Maintaining a quality organization is a big part of the cost of producing a drug. So poor quality drives out good quality in this business. And if we're buying the cheapest drug on any given day, that sends the system down a track where you have quality problems that leads to shortages and production goes offshore.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we'll turn to Tori next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tori Mack, and I am Chief Medical Officer for Children's Hospital Association. And so our role, just generally, we're not too far down the street here, but we represent over 200 children's hospitals all across the country in all kinds of different regions, all kinds of different sizes. And our role in this setting and many of the settings I'm in is to make sure that I'm bringing the pediatric voice and the child health voice to all these decisions. And really being on that front end at the table when we're making these decisions, certainly. From a child health perspective, right, we've got 73 million children in the United States. We have, when we think about where they're served, certainly they're served in community hospitals and everywhere across the country, but over 50% are in children's hospitals. That means kids who have unique challenges. When we think about that, that percentage even rises higher. And we think about sort of the coverage when we talk about that piece, it's Medicaid for a majority of those kids as well. And so it's important for us as Children's Hospital Association to make sure that we are part of that in the conversations. And I do want to also say congratulations on this framework. It really pulls together years of work, and just how you were able to synthesize it just now, I think is an accomplishment in and of itself. And it's just really years of work put together to strengthen. I think there's a lot of opportunities in the system for sure, in terms of what we think about in terms of providing care for kids. And so when I think about the barriers, I'm always focused on, yes, these are some operational challenges, but what this means is actual care at the bedside is impacted, right? That means that clinicians, that pharmacists have to sort of fill in the gap. And so that's really, what we see from the Children's Hospital perspective. And so a lot of the effort and work ends up being pushed downstream. And I think this really gives the opportunity certainly for more upstream. When I think about some of the unique challenges for children's hospitals, certainly just to give you a little bit more perspective, right? Compounding, for instance, when we think about that, the Children's Hospital, that's about 70–80% of drugs at baseline, versus sort of 20 to 30 at the adult setting. And so when you think about that downstream impact of what that means for a provider who has to share the inability to be able to deliver that safe, effective, reliable care, it's super impactful. I agree with you in terms of the misalignment and incentives and pressures, right? That just sort of, even if we have a shared goal and we recognize that, it just really creates some challenges for us.
Thank you so much. And Brooke, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brooke Courtney from FDA. Thank you so much for having us here today, for hosting this meeting, and for all the work that you've done, Stephen and Maddie and Thomas, and the rest of the Duke-Margolis team, just to help continue to raise awareness of these issues and continue to bring us all together. It's been really helpful to have that continuity over the past few years. So I work in the Commissioner's Office at FDA, in the Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, which falls under the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. My background before the pandemic was really focused on making sure that we have medical countermeasures available when and where they're needed during public health emergencies. And during the pandemic, I think FDA's role, along with HHS's broader roles, really started to shift. I think at first we were really focused on federal efforts to secure supplies of PPE, like Arlene mentioned. But then really the work evolved into broader HHS and US government approaches to strengthen the resilience of our medical product and critical food supply chains. And I think as we were working on the response together in an interagency capacity, we're starting to learn from each other where a lot of the interdependencies were, where we had different tools to come to play, whether it be the Defense Production Act or supply chain visibility, certain data, that kind of thing. And so we really, I think a lot of the kind of laid the foundation for us, again, highlighting these issues, working together. So at FDA, we realized that there was a need to engage in that work and help coordinate that work across our agencies, given that we have such a broad range of products that we regulate. So in my role, we work closely with our centers, offices, and programs across all the medical product categories, drug devices, biologics, critical human foods, like infant formulas, medical foods, and animal drugs and feed, because I know today's focus is human drug products, but there really is a lot of interdependency with a lot of these different issues when we're dealing with some of the disruptions, and working really closely then also with our HHS, interagency, and external stakeholders. And just as part of how seriously our commissioner's office has been taking these issues, we recently established an FDA supply chain council where we're have a more formalized capability to be working together as an agency on a lot of different issues, in particular data sharing, data visibility, that kind of thing. And as Brian mentioned, domestic manufacturing. So were you asking us to also talk about where we fit into the space a bit, or,
Please, yeah,
or should I shift to barriers?
No,
Okay.
well, either or.
I will say one thing about FDA is we alone, I think it's clear, none of us alone can individually solely solve these issues. Even at FDA, with all the data we have, we do not have full end-to-end visibility of the supply chains of every product that we regulate. We do have a lot of data. We have a lot of really good data, but we also don't do things like procure products. We don't stockpile products. We don't make some of the investments. We don't do reimbursement like CMS does, and we don't have the capabilities to support industrial-based capabilities and investments like Asper does, and so on. Those are just a few examples. But we do have tools where we can help provide technical assistance on those efforts, supply chain visibility. We can develop new policy proposals, as Brian mentioned. We obviously, through our supply chain, our dedicated sort of shortage teams and supply chain teams monitor for signals of disruption and use our authorities where we can to respond to those and help mitigate them. And we're doing a lot of work to help advance some of the emerging technologies, distributed manufacturing, point of care manufacturing, that kind of thing. Again, a lot of that's in early stages, but we're working to support those innovations hand in hand with Asper and other partners. And then collaborating, obviously, is a lot of what we do. And just touching on a couple barriers, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. Others have already highlighted them, but I think that the data issue is a real one. I think all of us have some of the data. None of us has all the data. And when we're making big decisions about where to invest domestically, which products to prioritize, which API to prioritize, I think it would be helpful if we're on kind of the same playing field, the same page about what that is. We don't want to all be making sort of different decisions based on different data or different analysis of data. So as much consistency as there can be in coordination in that area, I think is helpful. The underlying economic issues, obviously, and then the unforeseen risks that we're dealing with. And I think it's also was touched on is really how we're defining critical meds or essential meds, again, with all the different lists, which ones are we focusing on? And then the final thing is, as already mentioned, just to have a sustainable demand signal for domestic manufacturing in the long term. So,
I think Tony might have set you up with that, with what you ended with there around identifying priority medicines. Where should we focus? I imagine you might touch on that some in your remarks. Go ahead.
Good, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tony Lukavich, and I'm an EVP at USP, but I'm also secretary of the USP convention. And I'd like to start there with the question about what brings USP here. There's a lot of ways we can answer that, but one of them is that last year at USP's every 5-year convention meeting, the 465 members of our convention, which is our largest governing body as a nonprofit, adopted a resolution, 1 out of 7 resolutions, that we as USP over the next 5 years will devote resources to making the supply chain stronger. So we are doing that, and we're doing it. The approach that we're taking is informed by our convention members, by our scientific volunteers, by our legacy, our global reach, all of that. So I'd like to thank the convention members that are here, by the way. It's great to be sort of in the company of family. I think that's the way we see it, and congratulate you, Stephen, and the whole team on the framework. I think the framework is awesome because when you're trying to make change, especially in policy, simplifying it is really important. We don't want people to go down, just rabbit holes and get stuck there. When this issue has been talked about now for years and we've come a long way, and I think we know solutions, right? We just have to be able to focus on making them happen. And maybe I could start with what we're doing at USP. One, I think of the most important things that we've done in the last few years is invest in supply chain insights. And our tool for that is the USP Medicine Supply Map. And the supply map now maps over 90% of US medicines all the way up to KSMs. And it's true that, there are challenges, so we don't have all the information FDA has for sure. Nor should we, it's confidential information, but we've built a medicine supply map on trade data and thousands of other public data streams. And it's shown to be very accurate in predicting drug shortages and in other elements of the work. Doesn't replace a complete data set or work that FDA would do, but we developed it as a tool that can inform decision making and help inform policy making too. And one example of that. So one of the things we're here to talk about today is the domestic manufacturing base, right? So, medicines don't just happen. They're made They're not just a plant that doesn't just turn a switch on and it happens. There's ingredients that go into those medicines. And our medicine supply map tracking of the upstream supply chain shows an enormous vulnerability to China for key starting materials. And you could say that, yes, it's a geopolitical risk. It's also reflective of the market dynamics in the generics market. So how do we change that? If we want domestic manufacturing, we have to find a way to make the key starting materials affordable, to find a place to make API in a way that's affordable. Can make it here, maybe we nearshore it sometimes, but the facts, what we're trying to do at USP is bring insights and facts to make smart decisions based on the right thing to do for each medicine. And the more facts, the better. So our goal is to put public data out there to inform better decision making. So just a couple of other things that we're doing. We have our chemists are working on projects to find alternative ways to synthesize medicines so that we're not necessarily always reliant on the most vulnerable materials. We do work internationally and we work with regulators around the world. So I think that international coordination is incredibly important. And then also we're exploring and working with stakeholders on nearshoring where it might make sense for some ingredients into the US supply chain. We're focused on the market challenges also. And this last discussion about creating incentives is something that we think to solve this problem, as our resolution directed us to do, you have to address that. And we come at it from a perspective of, we're known for USP quality standards. We have 5,000 of them for what defines a quality medicine. Why can't we define what defines it, what is a resilient supply chain for this? We have enough data that we should be able to make some calls as to whether a minimum baseline is reached for what would be considered resilient. And after that, we can talk about how we pay for it. Because today we don't pay for resilience, and it's not, and if we do, we don't pay for it enough because we don't have enough resilience. But we say we want to, we have to find some way to measure whether it's working. So we've put some effort into that. And finally, I just want to mention USP standards. We were founded 205 years ago to develop tools for quality medicines. We have 5,000 standards today that are used around the world and in the United States to help ensure that a medicine is a quality medicine. FDA inspectors use them all the time, right? And this is one of the most fundamental things to ensuring a resilient supply, a reliable supply of medicines. So that's our work. We're excited. And the work that we're doing, I think, is very complementary to the work that's here at Duke-Margolis also. A lot of it's relatively technical, some of it's very scientific, and working together on sort of the broader discussion and the policy implications, I think is a good partnership, and we're really happy to be here.
And we appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you and pretty much everyone in the room as well. So thank you for those opening thoughts. I'll turn to Tori next, if I might, just to ask, what are the impacts on providers and patients from shortages, and especially in the current context, like today or over the last few months, what things have you been seeing or hearing that are most most pertinent or having the biggest impact at the moment?
That's a great question. I think a lot of things are sort of having the impact, but if I may, just a little bit, when I think about all of the conversations, right, I've just challenged us all when we think about prioritization, right, sort of how does this impact kids as well? I think oftentimes as we're making these decisions, kids are not sort of at the forefront of it. And I understand why that is, but I would just challenge to just show just the impacts is sort of how I'll start that conversation. So I talked a little bit earlier about sort of compounding, that's a baseline, right? Without shortages, right? And so when we think about adding shortage into the mix, what does that actually look like for a clinician or a pharmacist? That looks like, okay, I made this very specialized protocol and I do it for the majority of the drugs. Now I've got to rework that entire protocol. I've got to think about what those safeguards are. I've got to think about from a patient safety standpoint, what does that mean? I've got to retrain my teams and my staff to be able to deliver it. I've taught takes time. Is that not necessarily all compensated time, as you can imagine as well, and it just impacts the ability to really ensure that kids have access to what they need to be healthy. And so when I think about the biggest impact overall, that's certainly it. When I think about some specific challenges we have right now from a drug shortage standpoint, certainly the platinum-based chemotherapies, I know we've chatted about before. Certainly if I think about carboplatin and that drug shortage in particular, but even, and so that's of course for cancer and treatment for children, of course that impacts them in terms of them being able to get medication in a timely standpoint, which makes a huge difference in terms of the impact on their health, and certainly a huge impact on their families' health and well-being as well. But even just from a hospital perspective, and so I'm a neonatologist by training, so forgive me, but eye drops. Right, eye drops are a significant shortage right now. When I think about how often that's used in a children's hospital, that's daily care. What's the workaround for that? How are we training and sort of how are we thinking about sort of those daily care needs? And something, again, putting on my my hat, because I always tend to focus on babies when we think about respiratory distress and so the timeframes that come in, right? A recent shortage around continuous albuterol has a huge impact in terms of care and sort of what folks can do and what you can offer. And so what does that look like in real time? That looks like delays, that looks like worsening sort of respiratory status, that looks like complications that don't necessarily have to be there. And so when I think about albuterol in particular, and it sort of goes back to the earlier question about our role as well, certainly we're in a connecting role certainly in many capacities. And so I'm able to bring forward these stories just from my personal practice in the past, but then also from our children's hospitals that have really diverse needs, service, rural communities, metropolitan communities, and everything in between as well. I'm able to bring those stories to connect them. I'm able to talk to you all, ensure that we're part of their framework in terms of the decision-making pieces, but then also connecting to policymakers, to government officials as well, to bring forward those stories is really sort of definitely important to us to be able to bring that. And we're always eager to partner and pilot as well, as we think about sort of new strategies and ways that we think about data, for instance, and how we can share the information. I will say, having worked in children's hospitals for the majority of my sort of career, children's hospitals are always willing to partner with each other and always want to share, honestly. And so the more we could think about some transparency and visibility into supply, to think about how we can, try to move from reactive to proactive is certainly the focus of our children's hospitals, and I would love to be able to support them and working with you all as well.
Right, thank you. And anyone else feel free to chime in as well. But I think what comes to mind for me when you talk through that is what I mentioned at the outset, which is we shouldn't have so many examples of drug shortages that have impacted anyone, let alone children. Like I imagine a world where we're just preparing for the what if, and we're doing drills around, if there might be a shortage of potential in the future, what would we do, instead of having to react on the fly. There's too much at stake with, kids needing essential medicines to just, say, we don't need some significant change in how the supply chain works. A revamp is needed.
Yeah, and I mentioned sort of what happens. That's real, but it's a real example, right? Sort of what has to happen in real time. We were able to, just using albuterol as an example, we were able to certainly make those connections. We were able to work with manufacturer to help ensure that we have supply for our children's hospitals. But to your point, that's not a sustainable model, and that's not something that we want to necessarily. Should be routine or what should be expected, and certainly need a system of solutions. And so I do want to also say that they're doing all of these things in the background of, oh yes, there's also a workforce shortage, right? That is specific to pediatrics in terms of certainly pediatric nurses, but then also pediatric specialty providers. And then also, by the way, the threats to Medicaid that are sort of compounding. And so to your point about on a daily basis, having to worry about those things and then also having to care for patients and kids to be sure is a huge challenge.
Right, definitely. And so Brooke, we'll turn to you next. So you've been part of And I would just applaud your efforts on when I worked with you on various coordinating initiatives. You brought together people across the federal government within HHS and beyond, and have done a fantastic job. So thank you. But I wondered if you could speak to how does HHS coordinate on supply chain currently? You mentioned the FDA task force that started recently, or the coordinating council, and what steps are needed to continuously improve upon coordination?
Thanks, Stephen. I feel like whenever I have a conversation with Stephen, I'm like, we need to coordinate. We need better coordination. Right? But I think that we have a really good foundation for coordination in the federal government. And I think if you look at the framework, looking at it, about 5 of the 6 elements, well, the 6 being federal coordination, right, really rely largely on federal coordination. Not federal coordination alone, but largely on federal coordination. So it is a really critical aspect of advancing this work. And it really, I think we all agree, it's essential that we all work together. And I think that's really one of the best parts of our job, where we get to work, especially in HHS. Arlene, Wayland, some of our former colleagues, Stu and Trini, who we still work with, and others, and also our White House partners. So I think that's one of the best parts, and where we learn the most too. As an agency within HHS, FDA has always, I feel, had a really strong relationship with our HHS sister agencies like ASPR, CMS, CDC, and now even new organizations like ARPA-H and others on a lot of different issues. But really starting around 2020, when we began working and collaborating really closely on these supply chain issues. So just to sort of revisit where we've been, and then maybe a bit where we're going. First, again, as we know, we were focused more on the acute response phases, but there was a real awareness in the government and the administration at the time that there needed to be more concerted effort around supply chain resilience. And again, as we were working with our interagency partners and learning, and I think really starting with the executive order on FDA, developing a list of essential medicines and critical inputs, medical countermeasures, where we work with our HHS partners on that, working on the use of our Defense Production Act the HHS Defense Production Act authorities, and those kinds of efforts really help bring us together on the supply chain issues in HHS, and then working together in working with the different White House efforts, including different reports, the 1-year report, the 100-day review, the quadrennial supply chain review, and so on. So we really work closely together on that. And around that time also, as Arlene mentioned, the establishment of the Center for Industrial-Based Management and Supply Chain, which is really critical for HHS's work. Within HHS, again, with the increased White House engagement and interest in supply chain issues, in particular in the drug supply chain space, but also in other issues like infant formula and medical devices, there was an HHS supply chain coordinator role. There was a counselor in the Secretary's office dedicated to supply chain issues. We established an HHS supply chain resilience and shortage working group, which then worked to develop a strategy around supply chain, an action plan, a data plan, research plan, that kind of thing, which remain in draft form. But really some good foundational work there. And ASPR is also, I don't want to speak too much for ASPR because I know Wayland is coming up next, but also HHS's Joint Supply Chain Resilience Work Group, which I know a number of you participate in. It's a group of, I think, over 200 now, public-private partners who come together and just share information about different supply chain issues and efforts and so on. That group also developed a critical medical device list, PPE standardization effort, and a number of folks in this room were involved in that, in particular Stu. So I want to give him a lot of credit on that. So again, there's a lot of foundational work within HHS that has gone into kind of where we are now. And currently, we do continue to coordinate really closely together. In particular, at FDA, we work really closely with Arlene's office on a range of efforts that have already been talked about. We work with the immediate office of the Secretary, CMS, and others. And this is largely on, again, providing technical assistance on different policies, domestic manufacturing efforts, and a lot on different responses and coordinating and sharing information when we're working on different issues that might for different situations that might cause supply chain disruptions. Some of this work also kind of merges with medical countermeasure work, so the work with BARDA and other parts of ASPR. And again, on the data sharing part. But I guess I do just want to emphasize, again, I will say this probably over and over again and be tired of hearing about it. I know the question focused on HHS coordination, but again, multiple departments and agencies, Department of War, State Department, Commerce, VA, and many others, and multiple offices in the White House, and you'll be hearing soon from Anna, really have critical roles in this space. And we partner within HHS, we partner very closely with those, again, on maintaining situational awareness during events that are occurring right now in the Middle East and some of the disruptions occurring with raw materials, sharing data across different sectors. You know, if we have a need for helium for MRI machines here, well, what other sectors rely on helium, or semiconductors, that kind of thing, and how are we going to do allocations if it ever gets to that point, you know, for different events. And then, as mentioned, really the international collaborations as well. So working with state and others. And I think a lot of this is to ensure that when we are within HHS working on efforts to support domestic manufacturing, for example, that we're working with one international partner and advising on, you know, certain API for investment or domestic manufacturing, certain critical products, that's in coordination with other discussions with other countries or partners, you know, so that, or other firms. And again, a lot of this is outside of FDA's purview. Arlene and Waylon can speak much more eloquently about it, but those are just some of the areas. And again, we can't do it alone in the federal government. So again, I know the question was focused on HHS coordination, but it really does, you know, sort of require us all to be part of this. So
yeah, thanks, Brooke. One thing I took away from that in terms of good coordination is giving call outs to people when they've done good work. So that's an important thing.
I'm sorry if I forgot to mention anyone in the room. There are many of you.
But Tony, we'll turn to you next. If you could just describe some of the work USP is doing around developing third-party reliability assessments, and how can that help to address root causes of these issues when tied with incentives?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I heard mentioned today that drug shortages have dropped, and that's true, and that's some good news. Unfortunately, we're not unfortunately that we're releasing this. We're releasing the USP drug shortage report, the third annual, in a couple of weeks, and there are some numbers there that aren't really so encouraging. That the 60% increase in product discontinuations, a 75% median price drop for discounted oral solids. So that's not good news. And it just sort of validates the concept that we need to do something to incentivize resilience and impact the market dynamics. I think the other good news is here there are multiple stakeholders that are talking about versions of this, right? We heard earlier today CMS, we heard the congressional perspective. So this is, I think, something that is real, that I think there's an awareness that something has to happen. What we're doing at USP is we're working with a range of stakeholders as part of the USP Resiliency Center, first of all, in our advisory committee that several members of the committee are in the room now, to get input on how we can do this. How can we really measure what's a resilient supply chain for medicine? And that's actually the other important part here, because we can't reimburse for a factory. We have to reimburse for a resilient supply of medicine. And we do have data sources now that can help us do that. May not be perfect data sources, but they're good. And there seems to be willingness across a range of different stakeholders in the very complicated ecosystem of pharmaceutical payments that want to engage in something that's workable. So this is what we are doing: market research and reaching out to stakeholders to learn about what they believe is reflective of a reliable supply chain. And we're using our tools with the medicine supply map as well to build something. The concept here is that, again, we need a baseline, we need to define, and we need to measure. And then create a payment incentive, which is not the easy part necessarily, right, in our payment system. How do we do that? We can do it through government purchasers, who's the most straightforward, government purchasers that purchase medicine, very straightforward. CMS, bigger impact, much more complicated. And then the third is the private sector, private payers, and that's complicated in different ways as well. And then something that I think we can do for sure after that is continuous improvement. As we learn what's worked, what has proven, where we've paid for and rewarded reliability and resilience, has it come through? Have we gotten that? And how do we look at new metrics going forward? So I think my personal opinion, this is a holy grail to solving this issue. And I think there's at least a groundswell of support. I know I know Laura's doing a lot on this too. So there's a lot of organizations that are interested in it. One thing, I didn't answer the second part of the first question, probably because I talked too long on the first part. But the second part on barriers. I think we have a challenge with context, not with the people in this room, but the incentives that we're all talking about. We act as if this is a lot of money. It's not a lot of money. It wouldn't be a lot of money. It's the generics industry is about 90 billion a year for 90% of our medicines. We take some percentage of that, that's essential medicines that we're going to give some incentive to, of that money. That is not much in the context of the United States. We're prioritizing children, the elderly, drug shortages to address it, and national security, and we can't find a couple $2 billion to fix the problem. That's not acceptable. I think we need to put more context on it, all of us. And, because we have solutions. We just need people to understand that they're doable, as Chan said, for sure, and put them in the context of what it would take. And it's not really insurmountable.
Yeah, well said. And we'll turn to Alan here for our last question, which is, if you could elaborate, you mentioned committed contracts, but could you elaborate on that a little bit more? And what's the role of committed contracts in creating a more reliable supply? And then what are the right incentives to encourage approaches that utilize committed contracting models to increase? There's a certain percentage of the market that uses it today, but it seems to be far less than what would be ideal.
Yeah, thank you. So let me first say what we mean in the Civica model by a committed volume contract. And then I'll give 2 or 3 reasons that I think that type of contracting is a really important tool, both for stabilizing the generic drug supply and reducing the number of shortages, but also potentially for onshoring the drug supply. Okay, so in a typical commodity market, you just go out there and buy whatever you need on a given day, and you buy whatever is cheapest, right? Number 2, red spring wheat, just go on and it's all fungible. But that's more or less how the generic drug market works. The way we do it, the way Civica does it, is we ask our members, when they've said we would like a drug from Civica, to make a particular volume commitment for a couple of years. And they can choose whatever level they want to opt in at. But if they don't fulfill that volume commitment, they pay the balance at the end of the year. In reality, that almost never happens because the demand for generic drugs is relatively inelastic. So these are all essential medicines. Hospitals know, fairly accurately how much they're going to need in a given year. And if they're putting 30, 50% into a committed volume contract, there's no chance that they're not going to need that volume in the course of the year. But what it does is prevents them from going somewhere else if the price drops. And we know that one of the root causes of drug shortages is continual race to the bottom on pricing. But it goes beyond that. And so, for generic drugs, at any given time, there are usually multiple companies that have an FDA-approved ANDA to market the drug. And most of them are on the sidelines. And they're on the sidelines because they don't have market share. And they're not going to come back into the market on the off chance they might get some market share. But if you can go to a company and say, for 2 years, we'll buy 10 batches a year, then they can put that drug into the rotation for production on the line. So it can keep companies who are already manufacturing the drug committed to manufacturing the drug. Because remember, those shortages correlate with low costs, right? So if you're making a drug that's selling for $1 a vial, and you could go make something else, you have a strong incentive to do that, which is why the $1 a vial drugs are usually in shortage. If you have a commitment from your purchasers to buy a certain number of batches, then you're going to factor that into your plans and keep making it. And as I say, you can bring other manufacturers into the market. What was the other part of your question?
Incentives. What's the right way to tie in incentives to increase uptake of these approaches?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways you could do it, and it was definitely part of the Senate Finance Committee drug shortages proposal, and we very much hope that Finance Committee will come back to that and continue to iterate on what they put out. So, and for those of you not familiar with it, that's using CMS payment to incentivize purchasers to do take or pay contracts. You could do it through CMMI as well. And as the administration looks at an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to really level the playing field on the cost of domestic and imported drugs, the incremental cost to incentivize purchasers to enter take or pay contracts is really minor. It's really covering, the administrative cost of doing that, because you're not paying for a more costly drug at that point. And as I say, the risk is really quite manageable to these contracts. I think there's a number of ways you could get there.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. If you could all give them a round of applause.
We have a great panel here, and then I love working with this group here because I think you've got to know it so well over the years. But let me just do quick introductions, and we got Hannah here just in time. So we're not in order, but we'll start with Waylon. So you play the guitar?
No, I play the acoustic bass.
Acoustic bass? Tell me more about
that. I play at the jazz club in Georgetown, Blues Alley.
Okay.
I play at Birchmere. I play in the Kennedy Center.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Hey, we got some talent here.
Yeah, I was in the Navy band years ago. So I play, and one good thing about bassists, they're always really good at fishing because they really know their scales.
Okay, gotta move on. So, Aaron, you managed correspondence on the Hill. Tell me about that.
Oh, yeah. So it was a glorified title of correspondence manager, which simply means I was the gatekeeper between barrage of email and our staffers on the Hill. So I remember I was fussed at from anything around your boss has been, is the reason why egg prices are so high. So here I am researching egg prices going, why are they high?
How old were you at the time?
Gosh, well, I was 22 when I started on Capitol Hill, but it also ranged to even helping like a veteran who was having difficulty getting his veteran affairs benefit. So, that was some good moments there, but then there are probably some headaches.
So, I'm afraid I don't know you that well, but you got to tell the story about yourself.
Well, I'm a tenured full professor, so I can talk about myself for the next 40 years. If you don't know me, I work for the Department of War at the Uniformed Services University and direct the Center for Health Services Research. And so this pharmaceutical portfolio landed in my lap on a Thursday in October with a note from the Tracy do this from my dean. For those of you in academia, your boss says do this and you do this. But my background in pharmaceutical supply chain and pharmaceutical safety and quality goes back to, I scaled up zinc for the treatment of childhood diarrhea in Bangladesh, which was funded by thank you, saving lives 50,000 at a time. So in Bangladesh, and the zinc required an international technology transit. It's sort of prescription level zinc. So we did 5 policy changes in Bangladesh to get it over the counter, advertised on TV. And we had to go and do quality assessments of pharmaceutical firms in Bangladesh to find the right acne pharmaceuticals who could receive the tech transfer from France for
No
those
kidding.
dissolvable zinc tablets. So I am the baby zinc lady from Bangladesh, and that is really my only pharmaceutical experience prior to walking out like the boss that
I think that's very nice. That's great.
So
And then I think Anna's got the best story because we worked in the chocolate science laboratory.
Yeah, which is actually a student group at MIT that, depending on how you frame it, either exists to like use a facade of science to get free chocolate on the order of 500 pounds per year, or uses the facade of chocolate to get people interested in supply chains and chemistry, and you know the 6 different melting points of chocolate until you have different crystallization forms, one of which is hard enough to, I've not done this, but I have talked to a Swiss German chocolate scientist who has. If you melt chocolate in, I think it's a 6th crystalline form, and it's hard enough to actually hammer a nail into a block of wood if you do it properly.
So we have a group. We have the best group everywhere. But our topic, right, which is very related, is the coordination for goals on domestic manufacturing. Duke, we just had a paper published. If you actually go to the agenda, there's a QR code to download it. The focus had 3 goals, right? One was national security, which has become paramount these days with geopolitics. When we worked at the White House, and we had a great team working at the White House, by the way, didn't we? You and me, all over there, and Anna was there too. We were not so much focused on national security. We're focused on drug shortages. National security is a wonderful lens to look at as well. It becomes so important to make sure we access these medications. There's also a focus on jobs, right? Employment as well. Training is really important to make these drugs fair, and then the regulatory constraints. We have specific objectives. We'll talk about incentives. I think allies as well. As we know, we can't make every part of every drug here, so we need to work with allies. How do we do that? I think someone mentioned the environmental challenges as well. One thing that I've heard is that in China, they've actually overcome some of the environmental challenges of making KSMs by having a much more educated workforce, and that's no longer an issue. And so we can learn from how they've educated and upskilled their workforce as well. And then the FDA, there's been a lot of progress there as well, but we want to make sure that we can accelerate that progress we have folks here. When we talk about manufacturing, also at the White House, we did a study on 5 medications and how much it would cost to onshore. We're working with Paul on this one, and we looked at the 3 components: final dosage form, API, KSM, 5 different drugs, and realized it costs billions of dollars to do that in many years if we're going to do the whole end-to-end spectrum. And these are just the KSM, API, and FDF. You've got to think about the filters, and if there's an adjuvant, and assays, et cetera. These are also in shortage as well. So that mapping becomes very, very complex. But if you narrow it down to a few drugs and create a template that you can replicate, it becomes a lot easier. And if you focus on things like antibiotics, used for 14 days, the cost becomes so low. But you don't just have to stop at 5 antibiotics. You can start with that, and you can replicate where you need to. But having a common framework to do that is important. So we need to understand the cost of capital investment, but then we also need to understand sustainability. One thing I was saying this morning is, I work in Operation Warp Speed, and we had spent billions of dollars creating, emergent biosolutions, Novavax or capabilities. And then when the pandemic hit, they didn't deliver, right? Because we didn't create constant demand. We saw this with gloves post-pandemic as well, right? PPE. So we have to make sure that we don't just build it, but we create demand for it as well. I always say the most resilient supply chain in the world is cocaine. You can get it anywhere, right? You can bomb boats, you can just put a whole police force, but it's still accessible because there's demand, right? It's very resilient. So when we look at this, we got to make sure that there's resilience here too. There's demand, there's incentives. And so with that, I'm going to ask a few questions to the group. First of all,
Chocolate too.
Chocolate. Alcohol too, right? Yeah, right. But when you look at the paper and the objectives, I'll just go down the line here. What was something in the paper that you thought was very interesting that you wanted to perhaps talk about?
Yeah, congrats to Duke for that document. I like a good read. I don't always get one that comes across my desk, so I like a good read. So thanks How are you, Stephen? You and your team. You and your team. Great job.
Thank you to you.
Yeah, I know the folks in the back probably did most of the work. You just kind of read it over.
These two did some incredible work.
Couple items for me from Asper's perspective. The first one was it talked about sort of an HHS-wide like group, working group or enterprise-wide a group to look at supply chain disruptions, challenges, because I really think there isn't any one octave in HHS that can cover all the bases. FDA covers a good portion, ASPR covers, and I've worked this out with FDA, so I know I can say this safely. They kind of cover the micro commodity level information. We're covering the macro industry-wide information, and we've agreed on this. Andreas Schick and I, that this is kind of how we're going to work together, and we're going to do projects together. That's good. So having the CDC at the table when we need them, NIH, I mean, everybody bringing whatever the problem is. Like right now in the hantavirus and the Ebola thing coming up, lots of people are coming to the table. There isn't one organization in HHS. So that was one point. I wanted to put something about that one. The second one was the whole notion of reimbursing on reliability rather than cost. A good performing supply chain gets some money for that, gets some subsidizing for that. A good supply chain that can respond to the surge, that's got a built-in supply chain resiliency plan that just because there's a surge, we're okay. We can still keep going. And they built it in, they showed it to you, they proved it, and they have the numbers and the metrics, and then we write them a nice little check and say, good job, more of that, please. And that, I think those two ideas right there for us was what rose to the top. I know there were a lot of other good ideas, but for me.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, looking through the report, going to the actual goals, one in particular stood out was the restoring 25% of APIs, I think, by 2030. And the reason why it stands out to me is because obviously it's a SMART goal, time-bound, manageable, all those good things, but also it forces a level of prioritization. Basically, the question comes to mind, which are the 25 then? And so if you have API 1, API 2, both have no domestic source. One is with a TAA compliant or ally country, one is with one that's not. Do they carry the same risk profile? Same example we apply to if we have a domestic source for a particular medicine, but it's a life-sustaining medicine versus one that you have no U.S. source, but it's kind of a life enhancement. Then are they weighed the same? And so I know there's been great work with some of those in the room from USP and others, but I know we're also looking at this intently, looking to develop what's called a national fragility index. And where what we want to do is really look at these like 3,000 different medicines and grade it in a weighted fashion based off of geopolitical conflicts, natural disasters, going to clinical need, manufacturing kind of capabilities. Like, do we even have the infrastructure in the United States to actually produce it and actually give it a weighted score? Because then we can actually start to look and say, what is the most fragile medicine and how do we start to rank them? Then we actually make an informed selection of that list. Long term, it will be great if we can then, as the progress is made on the NFI, it's looking to how can we be proactive, meaning anticipatory, not reactionary. And so where we see vulnerabilities happen that impact certain supply chains up into the KSM, can we now anticipate how the ripple effects are going to impact our medicines? The last thing I'll mention is on the workforce development side. We've been to a lot of the conferences about workforce development, so I won't go into all the detail that we need workforce development. But when we lost manufacturing jobs for genetic medicines, we also lost those jobs. Also, when we're reskilling or needing to reskill and bringing in advanced manufacturing technology, we need to actually skill the current workforce and the future workforce in that. And so there's also kind of a marketing strategy and how do we get the next generation to look at the manufacturing industry as a very technical, sophisticated industry and not where some kids find I'm going to be a TikTok influencer star or whatever they call it these days.
Yeah, be a steady job. We were talking earlier this morning too about just pharmacy schools and the need for more education around pharmaceutical science, right? And we've lost a lot of that as well.
Right.
Not crazy.
Awesome. So to start by talking about sort of education and the education issue, I actually think that that can be solved in two ways. And I talk about this a lot. That's a visa problem. We go to events and people stand up and they're like, you don't have enough chemists to onshore and meet the onshore needs. There are plenty of chemists on this planet, many of whom might be very happy to make a nice life for their families living in America and working in our pharmaceutical industry here. But you're right, we need to, encourage children to go into STEM and prepare them for that throughout, sort of their educational lives, so that then becoming a chemist or a pharmacist is an exciting possibility, and they know what the jobs are and that there's going to be great salaries there as well. And I do work in education because I'm a professor at a university, and I think that's a problem that can be solved with both short and long-term solutions. But I wouldn't work for the Department of War if I didn't talk about, I love your idea of a fragility index, but in terms of incentivizing and domestic production, what the Department of War wants isn't so different from what all the other health systems in America want and need. But we have a bifurcated interest in the Department of War between the 9.6 million beneficiaries who receive their care through the military health system domestically. About 35% do it through our own direct care system of military and Department of War owned clinics with pharmacies in them. But everybody else goes out on the economy and uses the TRICARE benefit. So that's a bifurcated system in itself. And at the same time, we have our unique go to war mission, right? Where we've worked with the FDA for decades to keep those supplies ready. And it's called SHELF, the extended life program, the well-being of the drug products. Are they still safe to use? But at the same time, what we put in those stockpiles, what we pack in our kit to go when the balloon goes up for the nation, we have to look about that. And the drugs that we need for that might be different from the drugs that HHS has. We have a very unique relationship with TXA. No one else uses it the way that we do. For us, it's a very important medication. For everyone else, it's a surgical side hustle, right? So that rises to the top of importance for us in a way that it won't for HHS. Yeah. And so I think that the strength of the Department of War isn't that we're 2% of the market. The strength of the Department of War is the leadership that we can bring in a crisis like we did during Operation Warp Speed. So thank you for the great paper, Stephen.
Yeah, definitely. And shout out to the Defense Logistics Agency, which recently sent us a whole bunch of calculations for tariffs and Medicare policies, which have nothing to do with their core, sort of the core calculations that they usually do to protect the warfighter, but everything to do with the overall mission of bringing together sort of all of the different facets of government who are working on so many different angles to think about how do we come up with sort of a unified all of government strategy encompassing sort of all of wide variety of these sometimes divergent but often very aligned goals. Because when you look down, we're probably talking about different form factors at the FDF level, but everyone's going to need antibiotics. And so there's a consensus that if you're reading about US antibiotics recently, they were struggling until Walmart came and picked up with some of their new domestic prioritization mission. And that's the only amoxicillin that's produced in that form factor in the country, right? So not an endorsement of either of those, but there is a massive role that the private sector has to play as well. And the government, whether that's the 2 to 3% of demand through direct procurement, so government purchasing of through Defense Logistics Agency, which also buys for VA, and so that's convenient in that you sort of have an aggregated purchaser. But then they have very different formularies because one's targeting veterans and the other is targeting active service members. And then you add in your TRICARE and maybe even federal employee health benefits plans, which is the largest employer or the largest employee health benefit plan in the country. And could they start incentivizing something around domestic or resilient and pharmaceuticals And then, of course, you add in Medicare and Medicaid, and the states have started thinking about this as well. The state of Texas has a whole new initiative because they have a lot of the petroleum products. So why don't they start thinking about producing KSMs? What would that look like? And then how could they incentivize more of a domestic formulary? So there's sort of all of these different pieces. So coming back to the report, appreciated the, shout out to our office. Thanks. We're cool like that. We're the Made in America office, but also the notion that sort of the executive office of the president and the White House exists to corral all these different strategic interests. And so find out whether that's figuring out the tariff, what would be most effective in terms of building protectionist walls to keep out predatory pricing from abroad, or where we can work with, say, the intelligence community if there's some emerging threat. I think we're very good at the disaster mitigation piece because that forces everyone to come together and agree on what the priorities are very quickly. But in the day-to-day resilience, it's a bit more of a struggle because there's so many divergent goals that it's kind of a constant process to bring everyone back to the same table and say, all right, well, what are actionable goals to actually come up with some metrics? And then especially the transition from, the Biden White House was fantastic in writing really good reports and coming up with sort of nebulous ideas. And then there was some, I think after Operation Warp Speed and the whole COVID, there was so much action orientation around COVID, but then in terms of the long-term resilience, it was much more of a sort of academic vibe. People were more timid with not the people in this room, but like the actual decision makers. I think there was frustration seeing like, all right, well, where's the action coming? And then you bring in more business focused types for the current administration and it's all action. It's like, hang on, maybe we should write another report or two. Whereas under Biden, it was like, maybe we should stop writing some reports. These were great. Let's figure out what to do with them.
That is a good characterization. I did feel with the Biden administration, it's like, we haven't talked to them yet. We should talk to them. And it's more of a report. With this administration, it's like, move fast. And I'm like, just don't break things while you're moving fast. But I do find the level of coordination amongst different agencies with the White House has just been fantastic. The meeting you had a couple months ago at the White House, we brought every agency in, and that was fantastic as well, and led by your team. So
shout out to National Security Council, National Economic Council, Federal Procurement Policy, as
but
well.
that's just it.
OVP as well, I think.
Yeah.
And then Senator Scott's team.
But the idea, you brought in the VA, you brought in CMS. It was bringing all the right stakeholders to something that was really important. But to build on what you're saying about incentives, one of the things that to provide incentives, you got to say, well, here's how much the incentive are that we need. But you need to understand, okay, what is that ROI? What is the burden of, when you develop drugs, you price drugs, you look at the pharmacoeconomics. You say you price the drug based on burden of disease, current care. There's quite a methodology around that. In this case, how do we measure what the burden of drug shortages is that helps them define what the incentives are?
Oh, easy.
Why did we put you on the spot?
No.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do a left turn on you because I think we have to think about this differently. The old way of thinking I will describe as the old RFI, RFP, we buy it, we put it on the shelf and or whatever. How do we get, and we are mostly concerned with generics at Asper. We figure the branded industry is taking care of itself. They got plenty of cash.
Yeah.
So we're mostly focused on generics. I think we've got to come up with, and just to tag on what you were saying earlier, the amount of cooperation going on right now within the government, between agencies, WAR, VA, HHS, all the optives. Everybody is sitting down with OMB and said, how do we fix this problem?
Yeah.
What can we possibly do to bring these generics back home, get these jobs at home? The economics doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
You're right, unless you look at it differently.
Yeah.
So go with me here. All right. Go with me here. Let's think outside the box. What would it take? And if you're thinking like an investor, all right, not like a government representative or even an academic, as an investor, I have a certain concern and need I have. What do I got to do to make it interesting to an investor? So what could I possibly do to company A who makes a medicine, an antibiotic that we absolutely have to have? It's national security, right? Cephalosporin or amoxicillin, gotta have it. I know you don't make a lot of money on it, but I gotta have that. It's got to be here, and 97% of it is made in China. I've got to have that here. Chief of Staff of the Army is going, what? I got to have that here, right? Okay, so what would make it interesting? So when you sit and talk to people who are really trying to nuke this out, how do we get the interest going here? We've met some really interesting people in the agencies, and see what's interesting about all the agencies. They each have different authorities. They each have different tools. They each have different go-tos. They can pull, but not all of us have all of them. So we've got to work together. So what if we could say, if I said to company A, I need 3 production lines of cephalosporin to really solve the problem in my country. And they say, it's not, I can't make that work. I can't make enough. Okay, what if I gave you 3 more lines that you can make peptides on? For those 3, and now you have 6. But these 3 are for us. You save them for us, you keep them for us. These 3 are for you, make all the money you want. And he's going, okay, I'm listening. What if I could give you a long-term contract, service contract to go with that?
Predictability.
So again, if I'm an investor, I'm going, okay, all right, now I'm seeing a way forward now. What I'm saying is people are now going down different lines, thinking differently about how do we get this thing on shore? How do we make this work? You say, well, that's going to cost a lot of money. Here's the thing about that. I come from defense years ago in a prior life. I like the Defense Department. I love it. We need the Defense Department of War. We need the Department of War. I like that carrier silhouette out there on the horizon. When I was in Desert Storm, I liked seeing it out there. It gives me comfort. But it costs a lot of money.
That's right.
But we're willing to pay that bill as a cost of doing business. Because we like the security. Well, now you'll see everyone across the agency saying, pharma is just like that now. It's national security. Maybe we just have to be willing to pay the bill for things that are critical.
An aircraft carrier is $20 billion.
Okay.
So if you wanted to calculate in terms of aircraft per aircraft carrier.
I'll stop there for it. You can see my point.
I love that. You want diversification. You're essentially discounting capital costs, but you're also saying here's the demand guarantee as well. I think that's fun.
So in terms of return on investment, I look at it in a couple of different ways. One would be how do we mitigate risk? And so how do we look far enough upstream to understand that if certain things were to happen or come to reality, they would be detrimental. So when we started looking at it that way, we started finding ourselves not just at the finished drug product, not just the API, but then the KSM. So, okay, now we're understanding that if something were to happen with the KSMs upstream, they will have ripple effects downstream that are unreversible or can be catastrophic. Now, how do we now try to allow for KSMs to have more volume to grow and to be a viable industry in the United States? Well, one way would be, is there a way that you can find cross-use for the KSMs? So KSMs that are getting used in pharmaceuticals can be used in other industries. So some of the research that we've done just by our work in other APIs is we found that one API that could be, the KSM could be used in like ammunition, just by talking with our university partners. And so we didn't know that, we just kind of stumbled into it. But there's no list of what KSMs have applicability across different industries.
They're so fungible.
And so a next kind of consideration is understanding and having a clear kind of investment strategy. And what I mean by that is I love the announcements of the new greenfield bills, and it's great. 8 years from now.
That's right.
So do we have idle capacity in the United States where we can leverage the funding that is being provided by the government to revitalize current manufacturing practices using advanced manufacturing technology? Can we start there first? And then lastly, it's really being able to kind of measure success. Don't measure activities, measure outcomes. So I don't care about how many new plants are being built this year. I want to know, did you reshore these KSM and APIs? Did you eliminate single points of failure?
Yeah.
That's what we should.
Not just breaking ground,
Right.
right, product, yeah, that's right.
Awesome. I want to go back to your initial question about how we predict resilience in the future. And I think part of it was we've done perhaps not as robust a job of looking at resilience or shortages collectively in the past. And so when my center came into this space, the first piece of work that we released, and it was one of the top papers at JAPA in 2025. And it was actually really like not methodologically complex at all. We took several essential medicines lists. We looked for which drugs were on all the same list, right?
Yeah.
And the drugs that were on all of the lists, we named them tier 1 drugs. And for the tier 1 and the tier 2 drugs, we looked at what had been on shortage in like the previous 10 years and why. We have the ability, and this was really exciting to both the Domestic Policy Council and the National Economic Council, which still boggles my mind because it's such sort of a classic health systems public health approach. I'm delighted that we tapped into something that hadn't been done that the nation needed. But more importantly, what it does is it shows us what drug products we need. The ability to apply a layer of predictive analytics, as you all are doing, we know what the population is. In many cases, we know what the risks are. I mean, there's always going to be that, we can't even call them black swan events anymore because, you know, we're having hantavirus, right, on a ship in the middle of the ocean. We're having a big Ebola outbreak again. So that we can't look at COVID and that epidemic as like as a pandemic as being like a one-off. So there's always going to be something else or something more. But we do have the ability to predict shortages in the supply chain. It's not, you know, I think some of it though has to do with the quality and quantity of the data that are available to make those decisions. KSMs, where are they from? API, where is it from? The excipients, where are they from? How much does it all cost?
Yeah.
And again, if we look at it all through that national security lens, which I like to do because I work for the Department of War, it's what's coming from China, because I don't know that there's any other agencies in the room that will be, if the National Defense Authorization Act for 2027 says the Department of War will no longer spend a dime on any drug products that have a KSM or API from China, that is what Congress will say, and we will step out smartly, you know, to meet that. So we'll get 180 days to roll that out. But we will have to step out smartly to meet that need. And I think that our ability to think that way and do that work exists. I just think that the tools that make it have that user-friendly front end are elusive to us right now. And I don't think they should be. I think I don't think this is a hard ask. I think it's just that it's not there yet. But it's not like we could have it 3 to 4 months from now, right? It's about the data and it's about building that the veneer of analytics on top of it.
I think the question around incentives and dollars is perfect for OMB.
Sure. So again, one of the challenges, just to follow up with why, you know, DPC and OMB and NSC, NEC it's often the same people who are in the room worrying about building the aircraft carrier and then worrying about where the pharmaceuticals are going to come from. And so having the rest of that expertise in, you know, FDA, across HHS, across our DOW colleagues is really important, because when you're talking about KSMs, like this could be coming from a plant, this could be coming from some petroleum derivative, this could be platinum, right? And so knowing that incredible diversity of the supply chain and being able to go deep is something that at the top levels of policy making, we'll have a couple subject matter experts, but nowhere near that really subject specific depth of knowledge. So thanks to everyone for commenting on the rules and regulations and continuing to publish as well. On the incentive side, we were thinking about shortages very specifically, you know, to justify that budget line item, in the sense of I can't remember who, I think Mariana had done some work on this. There was some research on sort of the actual impacts to the patients if they have to use if they don't have the available drug, or if they have to use a substitute that's less effective.
There's also the burden, the labor hours used at the hospital to try and find a substitute, or to try and figure out some other way to mitigate it. And so quantifying all of this really does help someone like the budget office figure out, do we spend our $20 billion on another aircraft carrier, or do we take a small fraction of that and focus on antibiotics?
Yeah, I think and I think that, it's just wonderful to see what progress has been made, right? I mean, led a lot of it by you, but, you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think, USP's been doing this for years with the MSM, but now we have APICS doing this as well. We have Johns Hopkins. And so I think the visibility in the supply chain is become a lot easier. Now it's managing that supply chain as well. But we're making, I think, a lot of progress, really has been made. One thing that we often ask is how much more money is the government going to give us, right? Is there a way for industry to manage this on our own, right? So when I look at drugs, I look at the value to society. You mentioned the aircraft carrier, it can kill a lot of people, but a drug saves a lot of people, right? And in fact, if you look at how lifespan has increased in the last, 50, 60 years, but also how your life has become better, it's because of drugs, right? Prescription drugs, not cocaine, but chocolate. But I think, if there's a 2x2, and you look at the cost of for antimicrobials and the impact to lives, it is the highest value commodity you could have, yet we don't value it that way. And so, the question is, does industry value this, right? Why aren't hospitals or GPOs or manufacturers saying these drugs save lives? We should pay more for them so they don't go into shortage. What is that kind of challenge where we're not seeing the value of these drugs? And I want to talk about market efficiencies. Is a lot of finger pointing within groups like, oh, well, these people are not valuing it. Their people are not paying more. What is the underlying cause that we're not valuing these drugs as we should be?
That's a really good question.
Insurance companies, why aren't they saying we'll pay more? Because when a drug goes in shortage, we've got to pay for hospitalization. Why aren't hospitals saying we'll pay more? Why aren't GPOs saying, we'll negotiate better prices, higher prices for longer term contracts?
No, I think it has something to do with the economic wins. We are finding plenty of dollars to invest in Ozempic.
Yeah.
Whatever the soup du jour is, and there's money for lots of that, but we're not really looking across the medical manufacturing landscape to say where else are we? We know APIs are a problem and KSMs, but where else? Is that the only problem? Yeah. No, there are others. But rather than taking a deliberate approach to that, like maybe in the Pentagon sense where they do the dot mil PF and look at requirements and they say where are we missing things? Yeah. We're letting the economic winds blow us this way and that, depending on demand from the public or whatever, rather than taking a proactive approach. Say, wait a minute. That's why in ASPR we've written the first ever industrial-based strategy that will be coming out later this summer, in which we started a summit to talk about is taking a quick look at our capabilities. Where are the gaps? What are the priorities of those gaps? Which ones should we fund? And work with industry together. Yeah. To solve these problems and look at, because I think a lot of it is just, well, this is where the latest investment is, and that's where the hedge fund wants to go.
Yeah. Well, I've always been ASPR and part of being a convener as well. It's not always just the money, it's the convening to solve these problems. So you did a good job.
Yeah, so a couple of those come to mind. I mean, what industry can do, they can do the R&D, they can do the, chemistry development, they can do the manufacturing, but they can't create fully the pull-through. And so in my mind, a couple of things that need to have happen is, number one, starting with federal procurement, we shouldn't award the cheapest medicines.
Yeah.
So, you need to prime the pump to actually see the federal government lead by example. We also should look into ways in which, there's like a transition support, meaning if I am a drug manufacturer, a drug producer, or final finished drug product, can you help me reshore that API? Meaning there's been a time where my line has to be down and I have to validate the API.
Yeah.
Is there a way in which you can bridge that gap? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And then there's other ideas like write the file. How about if you're doing domestic API, you have some exclusivity in front of the line in terms of when come up patent.
Yeah.
Ideas like that would be things that the government can do a lot to actually drive more demand support.
Quickly there.
Yeah, and I know that we're out of time, so I'm only going to talk about, Wayland touched on something that's dear to my heart. I'm really trying to bring the .mlPFP into the broader health services research literature. And I know that some of you in this room are aware of my particular obsession with the .mlPFP as a model. We've published several, my team has published, Center has published several papers where we take .mlPFP as a framework and apply different sort of findings, whether it's congressional recommendations to the Department of War around pharmaceutical supply chain and production, or I don't know, lessons learned from Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Let's go. But what might be missing more broadly for the United States across the agencies is an application of the .mlPFP
Yeah.
to say who is responsible for what element.
Yeah.
Because you can have a strategy. We certainly have a strategy. In your private sector company, you have a strategy. But how do we collectively, who is accountable for us as a nation? And it probably can only come out of the Made in America office. But there should be a .mlPFP so everybody knows both what needs to be done and which elements need to do it.
And
Yeah, pharma, if you ever look at pharma pricing, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
So this is a market that has never been a free market. There is nothing that relates to just, companies buying and selling, what is it, dispensation to like tuck and barter, right? This is a very heavily regulated government intervention at every single point. And so I think we don't need to be scared of imposing tariffs or supporting new manufacturing or doing new CMS rules, because this is just look up vanciclovir. The prices online range from $90 to $2,000 with a discount of $900. And it's like, how do you calculate?
Complexity is like, yeah. So we were gonna have Matt Damon come as a special guest for the panelists, but we ran out of time, so. Yeah. Thank you for the panelists.
Thank you.
Now, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Rhodes. I'm a policy research associate here at Duke-Margolis and working on the ReVAMP Drug Supply Chain Consortium along with Stephen. And we'll be moderating our final session here. So we're going to be focused on how CMS can support a more reliable drug supply chain and how CMS can support a domestic manufacturing base, and maybe you can talk a little bit about where those areas overlap as well. This area has been a focus for us here at Duke-Margolis for a long time, and as I was preparing for this, I was thinking back actually to about 2 years ago. We hosted a similar event highlighting some of the work that the ReVAMP Consortium had put out in our first 2 years. And we did have a similar panel discussion there, thinking about realigning incentives toward reliability, which I moderated with several of the same panelists who are joining us here today. And I think in some ways it can be a little bit frustrating where we haven't seen more progress since then. I think some of the same concepts that we maybe hoped to see adopted at that point are still kind of in that conceptual iteration phase, and we're continuing to push toward progress there. But I think some things certainly have changed, and I think one great example is the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking that CMS put out just a few months ago, adopting those concepts of thinking about how CMS reimbursement can shape the drug supply chain. So I think we are seeing some gradual progress in that direction, and looking forward to discussing that with you all today. So I'll introduce our panel here. Going from my left, we have Stu Evan Haugen, Director of Government Affairs and Policy at Fresenius Kabi. We have Angie Bolivar, President and CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain Association. Michael Gagno, Senior Director of Pharmacy Practice and Quality at the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. Nicolette Lewis-Saint, Chief Policy Officer for the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. And Ted Oja, Congressional Liaison, Analyst, and Regulatory Lead for CMS, specializing in inpatient supply chain issues. There's a lot of different jobs that they've given you over there.
A lot of hats. Yeah.
So by way of introduction and starting off the panel discussion, you each talk a little bit more about the work that you and your organizations are doing in the space, and particularly kind of how you view CMS payment policies as shaping the supply chain and shaping the way your organization works, or the way your organization behaves. And I'll kind of start from the top end of the supply chain and move on down. So maybe with Stu on the manufacturing side first.
I just think I'm the left side of the table.
Lined up perfectly.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, and thank you everyone, and I'm happy to be on this panel today. And for sticking with us to the very end here. So I'm Stu Evan Haugen. So Fresenius Kabi, we're a generic sterile injectable manufacturer, and we make 70% of what we make in the US, and a good chunk of what we make is on the essential medicines list. So we think we have a good place to speak from, in regards to what we see works and doesn't work. But we definitely, applaud CMS for putting out the ANPRM and for all the other efforts that are going. And I appreciate that sort of wealth of comments that have happened already today, in that this is sort of, it's a complex problem. It's not a one and done, but I think, all of the steps that we can make along the way to make progress are worth taking. So with this, it's something that we see as it's useful and it's beneficial. It's certainly something that I think will be effective as we look at sort of moving this way. My main sort of thing that I will come back to and we can talk about more is just to make sure that any changes that we make, that they can actually be quite simple in order to address some of these issues, particularly if they're clear, predictable, timely, and meaningful. So with those kind of design solution elements in mind, I think that we can move forward, and then through incremental steps we can definitely further progress. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And maybe next, let's go to Nicolette.
Oh, you jumped. I wasn't ready.
I jumped.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be with you, Nicolette Lewis-Saint. I'm the Chief Policy Officer for HDA. I'm speaking on behalf of distributors. We are the trade association that represents pharmaceutical distributors. Distributors basically do the work of moving about 10.5 million medicines a day, connecting 1,400 manufacturers to more than 300,000 sites of care. So we're thinking about the work of actually taking what is manufactured, regardless of where it is made, and moving it to the hospital, the pharmacy, the clinic, where that product then has to get dispensed, and in many instances by Mike's members. That is the work that we do. So we do have a lot of perspective on manufacturing, mostly because we work with manufacturers as a partner and understand the work that they need to do with tight margins to be able to produce the products that we all rely on. But we also have incredible sensitivity to the impact of shortages on facilities, recognizing that those are our customers, and we are working every day to make sure that they have the products that they need when they need it.
Thank you. And next, let's jump back over to Angie.
Okay. I'm Angie. I represent the Healthcare Supply Chain Association, and we represent the traditional healthcare group purchasing organizations. As I've done for the past 2 years, I'll just make sure everybody in the room is clear. We're not PBMs. We are GPOs that work specifically with inpatient hospitals. So just to be clear on what we do. Essentially, it's an entity that's been around for over 100 years. Think of it as kind of a co-op model, where hospitals will come together and they'll ask a GPO to go out, contract on their behalf, and work with suppliers, distributors, work with all of you here in the room, and try to get good, affordable, and accessible contracts available for hospitals to choose if they wish to use those. That said, certainly we have a really good line of sight, like Nicolette said, to kind of all the different players. I, as everyone has done, applaud Duke for bringing this group together. It's so easy in the drug shortage space for people just to point fingers. And I think that's what's really nice about groups like this, is that we're actually looking for solutions. And I think that's wonderful. So we were thrilled to see the CMS thing. I will get more into details, certainly, about different things. The one thing I would say is we always think that it's wonderful when we're able to recognize that hospitals will need to pay more for drugs made domestically. That's just a fact of life. And providers, I shouldn't just say hospitals, providers, sites of care in general, are working on very, very tight margins. They have workforce shortage problems. They've got a million challenges in their way, and they are all really trying to do what's best for their patient. And so affordability is always going to be important. That said, availability and having those drugs in hand is equally, if not more important. And so anything we can do to make that happen. The one thing I'll come back to later on is I think incentives make sense along the line, because there's a lot of things that the suppliers will make decisions on where they'll put their manufacturing facilities, where they'll source product, that the hospital is too attenuated on how they purchase. And so in order to try to make it at the source, I think it makes a lot of sense to have some incentives at the supplier end as well. But more to come. That's my thought.
Thanks, Angie, and appreciate the engagement from you, and actually everyone on this panel here has worked very closely with us in the the revamp consortium effort over the years. So really appreciate you all and the collaborative attitude that you bring to the discussions that we have. We go next to Mike, and then we'll round it out with Ted's thoughts on how CMS works.
Well, as everyone has already alluded to, I'm Mike Gagnon. I represent the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. We have about 65,000 members who are students, pharmacists, pharmacy technicians in multiple healthcare settings, not just acute care hospitals, also ambulatory care settings, community practices, et cetera. So we're a stakeholder as the end user of a lot of these products. Well, that's actually a whole different conversation. We're the purchaser of a lot of these products. We're close to the end of the supply chain, but ASHP also maintains a drug shortages list. Many of you are probably familiar with, and so we are very steeped in this drug shortage space because of the impacts it has on our members and on the patients that our members are taking care of.
All right, and over to you, Ted. On the recent ANPRM, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more detail about the actual provisions that were included therein. But maybe anything you can share on kind of whether this represents a shift in thinking at CMS and kind of a new sort of role or a new way of thinking about your role in shaping the upstream supply chain, or is this you view this as kind of more of a natural extension of the way that CMS has operated in the past? Kind of how do you think about the work that's been coming out of CMS recently?
So I do view the ANPRM as being sort of a natural evolution of other things that we've sort of done in this space. Mm-hmm. It does speak to sort of the PPE and essential medicine supply chain. We have done some sort of smaller policy making in those respective spaces. We do have policies that address sort of the domestic differential for N95 masks, sort of more in the PPE domain. We do have policy that talks about sort of a separate payment for establishing these 6-month buffer stocks of essential medicines. So kind of expanding the purview of it and bringing it more into the space of like, it's not just a select body of hospitals where it's not just, 1 or 2 items of PPE, and to kind of make it a more expansive concept is really, I see it as the next natural sort of step for what we're talking about. I think one thing that I, in sort of talking about clarifying what the ANPRM is, because it is sort of an odd vehicle in and of itself, is I've heard it referred to as sort of more of an RFI in a lot of ways. It is more in that way of like, it's an information seeking sort of vehicle with sort of this added intent to do something on the rulemaking front at some juncture in the future. So when we talk about sort of provisions and down the line that are discussed in the ANPRM, these are not something that, at least at the time that it came out in January, are a formal proposal of like, this is what is happening or something like that. It is sort of like, we are talking to you, the experts. We are looking for feedback from you, the experts in the private sector and in other sectors, of what is the appropriate way to go forward with this. And as far as like sort of contextualizing my role in it as well, I would say that when you see Alec Aramato, who spoke earlier and gave us sort of a broad view of the ANPRM and said more to come, so I appreciate him not stealing all my thunder on that particular front. I'm the one who's like more in the engine room reading your comments. So I'm the person who's like one of the people who's more putting pen to paper. I'm reading each individual comments. I am involved in discussions at various levels of leadership. I'm sort of briefing it up, but I am career in nature.
And as you review those comments, you're welcome for the lengthy comment that you submitted.
I would appreciate hearing.
Well, as you alluded to Alex Marks this morning, and something that he mentioned that I thought was really interesting was his focus on value-based approaches and accountability and reimbursement. And I think sometimes as I think about our work on incentives and preventing drug shortages, it strikes me as a sort of similar approach where we know that investing a little bit more upfront in reliable manufacturing and potentially in committed contracts can pay dividends down the road by avoiding those costly complications that come from shortages. And so I think that's a very useful analogy, and I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel on kind of how you view that, those opportunities for CMS to ensure that the patient impact from shortages is factored into reimbursement appropriately, and how we might take that sort of preventive lens to reimbursement in that way.
I'm happy to start on that one. You're hitting some of my notes from earlier, so thank you, Thomas. I actually love the idea of this accountable care, and there's a lot to like about it. There's a lot not to like about it, but from this aspect, I think it's a good approach to have everyone in the healthcare system understand that they are accountable for their patients. But that also includes the payers. That includes CMS, which I believe that CMS has our patients' best interests in mind. I'm not always convinced some of the private payers are. A lot of for-profit companies that are driving policies that require prior authorization, et cetera, et cetera. We're not here to talk about that aspect. What I think is more challenging, though, is there's two aspects of that I think are challenging. One is you have to tie a direct line from spending more on drugs to outcomes, which is, I think Anna mentioned earlier, it's very challenging to find data on that. There's some data, there's anecdotal data, there's some case studies. It's not easy to find what the actual outcomes on patients are. To say to your hospital CFO that's maybe of a 100-bed rural hospital that is struggling, we need to spend 10% more on our generic drugs so that our patients have better outcomes. It's not that easy. So I think that's one of the problems with that approach. The other one is right now we are in this race to the bottom, and until you have the outcomes aspect, but you also have to tell me that I'm spending more money on a drug and there's a reason for it. Mm-hmm. It's more reliable for supply. It's quality the way we expect it and not the way we read about sometimes in an FDA warning letter. Mm-hmm. And so as long as you can connect those things, that outcomes model of accountable care actually works, and it aligns the incentives that right now are not aligned.
Mm-hmm. And I do think in some ways there maybe is a little bit of a data gap there, where when we think about coverage decisions, say covering a new innovative medicine, there's a lot of data generated specifically on how that affects patient outcomes. How much better is that than the standard of care that we're using right now? And I agree that there's not a lot of firm data on that in the space of drug shortages. That's something we're hoping to work on more in the ReVAMP consortium this year, is a roadmap to how we could generate some of that data. I think we all have a strong intuition that that is how things would shake out, but I agree that maybe more data to back that up could be helpful in supporting some of those coverage and payment decisions. Thoughts from others on the panel and kind of how these incentives flow upstream and maybe some of the advantages or limitations of this kind of approach. I know Angie mentioned in some cases more supply side investments are needed for things that maybe will have a higher upfront cost, but how does this shape behavior upstream and where can it be effective, where maybe not so much?
Yeah, so I'll just real quick put a cherry on top of what Michael said, is that I definitely think the more data, the better. I think that's going to be informing a lot of the decisions. I think there have been some comments, we talked about it earlier in the day, that they're not being prioritized. And I don't know that I would say that anyone's not prioritizing them. I think it's that they don't have the data to know if one is more reliable than another. And so if everything looks the same, they don't have the money to spend extra in hopes that it's better. And so if there's a way to see, yes, if we can put this money in and that will be a better outcome for a patient, or it will make sure it stays stable, I think providers would love that. It's just they don't currently have that. So I always want to dispel this idea that hospitals are not prioritizing that, because that's certainly not the case. I will also say, I definitely, again, love the idea of having everybody have some skin in the game and having some reimbursement there with the hospitals, again, or the providers. I should stop saying that. All the providers, because at the end of the day, they need to make sure that it's always attached to the patient. That's what's always ended up. I think the only thing we were looking at is when it gets all the way down to a provider giving a particular drug to a patient, once that happens, that will have some effect on what a manufacturer chooses to do, but it's very attenuated from when a manufacturer is actually sitting down and thinking, I want to put a manufacturing plant right here, or I need to source materials from here. If the only incentive is at the end user, I think it's too far away from where the decisions are actually being made. And so to have some sprinkled along the way, or at least with the manufacturer side and the end user side, I think those are kind of the two levers. But I think you can't have one without the other.
I guess I'll jump in on that. And a couple of disjointed thoughts. So I think the first is when we do think about the incentives along the way, I do think that makes the most sense. And we've continued to applaud CMS's efforts to really think about how incentives flow and then kind of what the accountability measures are. I will continue to say, I think how incentives work for different intermediaries will look different. And really trying to get that, right size is going to be complicated, but we've continued to engage and offer solutions. To Angie's point, I just want to kind of double down on that a little bit in a different way. I think one of the things we have to be careful about is the impact on the physician decision. So ensuring that we can really think about measures of outcomes being flexibility for the physician and limiting burden on the physician while decoupling that from the prescribing and diagnosis decisions, I think it's really important. And that's not really our role, which to the point of the incentives is part of the reason that we think this is so important. Our philosophy is that all of the products that a physician might prescribe, that a pharmacist would want to dispense should be available. But what the physician decides to do, how the provider decides to actually determine care, really should not be impacted. And so really trying to wrestle with that, I think is something that we've been grappling with, and we just continue to try to engage in the conversations. Like, how do you measure flexibility and a reduction in burden as a success metric versus what they are prescribing? So kind of the part one of that. I would say on the distributor piece of this, I understand the race to the bottom language, and we've talked about this for years. But I think we have to take a finer lens to this. And, I think Waylon was talking earlier about just kind of the realities of the market dynamics. I think we are in a set of pharmaceutical economics where, yes, the price for some products is too low, but also the price of some products, one would argue, is too high. Also, there is no such thing as a pharmaceutical price, right? Like there are many different prices for the same product. And so while all of these things are true, and I don't think we in this space have to define or change any of those, I think it does change, well, maybe you do, but I do think it creates an opportunity for us to really think about how to apply a fine-tooth comb to this conversation. Is it the GSI space, that we focus on? Are certain products proving to be unsustainable in current market dynamics where we are seeing that there are many ANDAs available, but manufacturers are choosing to not manufacture those products? We have a report with IQVIA that actually makes that exact point. So I think it's not enough to just kind of take the broad stroke and say, this is a broad generics problem, because it's not. But I do think we're seeing vulnerabilities in certain classes and certain products that have been sustained over time, where we're saying the economics here may not be sustainable. And that may be the opportunity to make the finer adjustment.
Yeah, really, really great points. And I think that's an area where there's definitely not a lack of data. I think many people in this room and on this panel have done the work to identify which drugs are at the highest risk of shortage, where price is a particularly important driver of shortage risk. There's no shortage of shortage lists.
But I think, yes, and I know we always joke about like the which list do we choose, but I think there's like the shortage list, but I also think like one of the things that's really interesting to me is the ANDA list, right? So like, let's forget the shortages, the 15,000 shortages list that exists for a second. Like, there are, for many of these shortages lists, there are 6 or 7 ANDAs that are unused. So let's start to ask ourselves why, right? And maybe there's a different answer in that question than just kind of reiterating and redeveloping different vulnerable lists or shortages lists.
And I would just add, I acknowledge the complexity and the multiple players and completely agree that CMS taking action on something like the essential medicines list is an important first step. And that many of the drugs that we see in shortage and that we want to sort of encourage are looking at very low costs. So that to me presents itself as well as an opportunity that we talked about that a little bit in the session earlier, that even a small investment can actually have a big difference in this space. And so, we also would encourage everyone collectively to think about these solutions being very close to the sort of point of use or the point of the decision in order to help change a behavior. So if they're further down that chain they're going to just be too indirect, slow, and maybe out of pace. So having something where the reward is tangible and connected at that point of use helps it sort of actually be incentive and be implementable. And we can kind of talk about that more as we go. And basically, as we're looking, IQVIA data looks at more than 2/3 of these are under, $1, for those that are in shortage. So we could say, let's apply an upfront payment, maybe start with this pilot like we're talking about at the domestic manufactured essential medicines. And by applying that payment, we'll get data on uptake. We'll see what's working. We'll see what those things are. But there needs to be something that actually makes hospitals more interested in opting into a program like this. So there's a lot of sort of potential and opportunity in the space.
Absolutely, yeah, and a really great segue. Let's go back to Ted and dive into that ANPRM in a little more detail. Taking into account the points that Sue just made about how we need to ensure hospitals are actually opting in, that whatever approach is taken to drive these incentives is something that will actually drive that uptake. Can you talk about a couple of the approaches that you lay out as potential future steps in the ANPRM and how you took those points into account as you were drafting that up?
For sure. So within the ANPRM, there's sort of three central facets of it. And two are interlinked more closely than perhaps the third. So the idea of sort of a secure American supply chains friendly hospital designation, and that it would be something that hospitals would attain by meeting some sort of threshold for purchasing of certain products of PPE and essential medicines that are domestic in origin, and sort of also opening up this conversation of what is an appropriate target for what constitutes domestic, what definition of what of domestic is most appropriate in each of these respective spaces. And then for those hospitals that do manage to achieve this particular threshold, then also having sort of a payment that would be associated with this, a potential payment that sort of recognizes in a similar manner to what we've done in other supply chain policies that domestic products, for a variety of reasons, tend to cost more. It could be related to labor, it could be related to environmental compliance. We know that the regulatory compliance in the United States has its own particular drivers of cost as well, but that there is a difference in cost, and it is generally that the domestic and origin ones are more expensive. We understand this to be generally the case. And you can tell that I'm largely a bureaucrat because I'll be using terms like generally and likely and stuff like that quite a bit. So please bear with me on that particular, all the qualifying statements. And then the third facet of it is the inpatient quality reporting program measure. This would be sort of a yes or no measure where it's like, are you meeting this particular threshold? Are you doing these particular things to secure your spot as a secure American medical supplies friendly hospital? And then, having that visible on a public CMS website, likely Care Compare, is what was discussed within the ANPRM. And then from there, it talks about various, sort of examples of how we might calculate a payment adjustment for PPE and how we might calculate a payment adjustment for drugs. What would be an appropriate basis for it? Is it something for which we would source it from the cost report? Is it something where certain data sources would make more sense? Where does it make sense from both perspective of burden on these hospitals, which would be the ones that are sort of opting into it with their own purchasing patterns, and where in terms of administrative feasibility as well on our end, does it make sense to have this take effect or for us to source this data? And I do appreciate the other members of this panel and many others that have spoken before, sort of echoing the need for data sharing, talking about the need for greater insight into, we know that A causes B, we're not entirely sure how we get from B to C or things like that. That sort of data is also incredibly helpful to us when we're developing these sorts of policies and understanding these sorts of things and articulating what's an appropriate payment mechanism going forward. Also within the ANPRM, we sort of ask other questions. What is a purchasing threshold that would make sense? Is it 25%? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? Is it something that should be more on a continuous thing, or is it something that should be a binary designation? Is it something that would make sense moving beyond the inpatient Medicare share and moving into the outpatient Medicare share? Understanding that there are often different requirements that go into play depending on what body of Medicare patients you're talking about. Oftentimes when we're trying to drive things on the level of sort of, broadly characterize that as an incentive, but recognizing the additional costs that are intrinsic to certain types of purchasing, it's in a non-budget neutral manner. We want to say that, like, we recognize this is additional. We don't want to be pulling from one pot over to this other pot unless we feel it's more appropriate in this particular circumstance. That's sort of a broad stroke sort of thing, because at least in my estimation of the ANPR, much of it is asking questions. Much of it is information seeking, as I spoke to before. So it's honestly, this part of this panel that's so fun for me is not only do I get to hear directly from you on these things, but I actually get to put faith in name in terms of so many of the comments that I've read over on this and other policies.
Right. Well, yeah. Let's open up to the panel to hear some thoughts on this approach. I mean, we just talked about generally CMS reimbursement as a way to incentivize better behaviors in regard to shortage, but in terms of these particular approaches and this particular behavior that we're trying to incentivize of increasing purchasing from domestic manufacturers, how effective do we think this is likely to be? Let me start with Mike.
Which makes sense considering it's our members who are going to be affected by mostly. There's a lot to like here. There are some challenges I think that will be worked out. There is opportunity there for it. One of the things that I like about it is, I think, as Anna, I'm going to invoke your name again, mentioned, there's not been a lot of action, right? The last thing that I can remember, other than the critical meds, 100 bed hospital, buffer inventory support, IPPS rule, I think it's been since the CARES Act, since we've had really meaningful policy on the drug supply chain. Now, I think the folks from ASPR have left the room. The work they're doing is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. They're doing a ton of work on small scale. You can see the future in some of the investments they're making. But for large scale, changing behavior, to adapt to the definition of insanity, we're trying to incentivize a change in purchasing behavior. Unless you introduce new information, new incentives, it's not going to change. This is introducing a new incentive. So I like that it's action. I like that it's going to make the buyers think rather than click the cheapest price. What I think there's some challenges is defining domestic. I think that's easily, you sit down with a group of stakeholders and you say, okay, is the FTF enough? Is it the API? Where are the KSMs? Is it repackaging? Hopefully it's not repackaging, relabeling, but we can address those, right? Creating tiers, making sure that the drugs that are selected, there's actually enough domestic supply. That makes sense. I think looking at where the ANDA is, where there's gaps, could maybe get a private sector to say, hey, you know what? There's going to be incentive for hospitals to make a decision to buy this product if we step in. So I think that's a great point. Some of the challenges that go beyond that, I think, are, and this has nothing to do with CMS policy, it's what problem are we solving by moving things onshore, right? And I'll say this as a pharmacist, as a provider, don't always care where that drug has come from. The national security, absolutely an issue nationally. It's a problem. But from the individual provider, that's not something they're thinking about on a day-to-day basis. Like, oh, I should buy this antibiotic because it comes from a US facility and I'm going to guarantee that it stays on US soil. Those incentives aren't aligning. So what I'd rather see is incentivizing purchasing from resilient suppliers. And I recognize that it's much, much harder to define. Domestic is black and white, assuming you figure out the API FDF thing. And we know from inspection reports from FDA that domestic manufacturers are more likely to have a better outcome. So it's a step in the right direction. We're kind of going by proxy there, but ultimately we want to incentivize purchasing from resilient and reliable suppliers.
Agree 100%, Mike, and I think the top recommendation that we made in our comment was that there's a great opportunity to incorporate a metric on reliability into this payment using a very similar approach, paying for probably both domestic and reliability. I think particularly if we're going to pay more for the domestic supplier, we might as well make sure that it is a reliable one, even though there are some complexities in figuring that out. To your other point about the national security risk, I think that's true. I think that also could be considered a justification for why it's appropriate for government intervention here, right? That's not a priority that is necessarily the responsibility of every individual health system pharmacist or every sourcing person at a hospital, but it is something that if that's a national health security risk, I think that's an appropriate role for government to try and protect citizens from that risk. So I think that kind of goes both ways, but absolutely agree that that's a great opportunity to incorporate reliability as well. Thoughts from others on the panel on What to lay down for us?
I'll just jump in. Agree with everything Mike said. So thumbs up.
You nailed it, Mike.
Nailed it, nailed it. I'll jump in real specifically on the one you asked about, should it be continuous, on the incentives or binary or all that. We would recommend, I think, that having a continuous scalable incentive makes a lot of sense. It helps the smaller rurals that maybe don't have enough to invest, that they see some very large group and they're not going to do anything. That at least helps them do some. For those who hit, the medium threshold, it helps incentivize to keep going. On the flip side, it also underpins the very important point that Nicolette made about flexibility and physician decisions and how the clinical needs to happen. And so it allows for that flexibility for the provider to feel like they're reaching the patient the best way. So I'll get into a very specific answer, and that's what we like is continuous, please.
Understood. Thank you.
Nicolette, two.
Okay, so we also, I would kind of double down on a lot of what was said. I think that balancing of, and it's interesting, like I think about the IPPS rule a lot as we were responding, you could comment comments, but I think balancing what problem, let's see, are we trying to solve is interesting here, because from the national security side, a part of what I immediately think is, well, there's a two-part solution that is continuing to find incentives that push more into the system, while also thinking about strategically increasing the amount of product that is domestically available, whether that be in vendor managed inventory or some type of kind of rotating stockpile solutions for a number of products. And to me, there's an opportunity to think about that as a part of the solution, to say, how do we keep more along the way? How do we also strategically increase more that would be in the warehouses that is being rotated in a manner that is sustainable? And I think it's a both and solution there. I do always have concern, to Mike's point, around how we think about the problems that onshoring is solving for. So how do we not risk resilience and reliability? Because, Thomas, to your point, like, there's domestic and there's reliable. And the idea is that those metrics would be part one and part two, but the reality is that it may be one or the other in terms of how we think about that implementation. And so thinking about diversification and strategic diversification as a strategy, there's certainly parts of the supply chain where we would all agree we need to diversify immediately, right? But thinking about how do we, again, create that both and solution that means domestic and reliable, but also strategically globally diversified and reliable as well. And so that's kind of where distributors think about these things. And ultimately, whatever our hospital partners want to do, we will find a way to get it done. But being able to be really clear on how we think about these solutions. I should make one other point, which is thinking about where you want the product to live and how we design policy is very important, because of the flexibilities in terms of what problem are we solving for. If we're solving for the problem of the product needs to be able to be available wherever there's a need, does that make sense for that product to be down at a single site of care? Or does that have to go, or should that be a layer up to ensure that flexibility? So that's the other part of this, is as we're thinking about how we build incentives, thinking about maybe incentivizing distributors to hold product, recognizing that we think it might go to this state or we think it might go to this facility, but the reality is it may need to go somewhere else. And if it's already at the facility level, it is going to be harder to get that product to where it's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Sue?
Yeah, I would just say, I wanted to comment a little bit on the facility level designation. And I understand why CMS was thinking about going that way. And we would maybe just suggest a different approach, in that, in the spirit of that sort of clear, predictable, timely, and meaningful, that it might be a little more indirect at the level of there's 6,000 hospitals and clinics that they're all, that's 6,000 different decisions, probably more if you look at all of those. So keeping it at that level of, the more you use, the more reward you get. would allow it to scale if they do choose to opt in, and making that voluntary. And so on it being simple, the clear part is make the list sort of there was a lot of comments about lists and definitions, and I know you've heard all of those, but just sort of upfront, someone should know that this is eligible, as they're going in. On being predictable, something where like an NDC level add-on payment helps with that because it gives them certainty, as they're making those purchase decisions. And then the timely is by connecting it to the claim level activity, the activity and the reward is matched up. And then the meaningful, this is the part where it does get to where it could be that we're suggesting zero, that this needs to be not just zero sum, not just sort of covering the cost, but actually an incentive for the reward to go up. It could make it non-budget neutral, but we just want to acknowledge that could be a constraint in different decision makers thinking. But like Stephen and Claire were talking about this morning, we could be talking about, we have an example in our very lengthy ANPRM comment, but we buried it in the end. Make sure people read everything. That it could be at the level of about 0.1% of that overall CMS budget is about 100 million. And if we're looking at even at that level, that could be something enough to move the needle. But in any case, as we put that into play, it gives us as a potential additional benefit, as maybe potentially at that sort of national security or domestic resilience option, that we could have a tiered approach. And we weren't the only people to talk about a tiered approach, but we could have one flat add-on payment for U.S. finished dose, and then we could have a slightly larger flat add-on payment for U.S. finished dose and U.S. API, and that could be the level of like $2 per drug at the U.S. finished dose, maybe something more like $5 if it was finished dose and API. But what that could do is it would build in a structure that these other programs could then build from, so that once we have that U.S. API from Asper or whoever else, it would already be in place for a CMS payment to help give it sort of a gearing effect.
I appreciate the thoughts there on what makes this more kind of attractive or adoptable for the purchasers themselves. And any thoughts from others on the panel that want to elaborate on that point, on kind of what makes this easier to adopt and therefore more impactful?
I think it's easy to adopt from a health system perspective or a buyer perspective if you have clear lists, whether it's tiers or whatever. One analogy I like to paint, although the current political environment it may not be the best one, but look at the EV batteries and the tax rebates that were available. There's a very clear list of what qualified. And I don't know if you've considered that, but if you're leaving it up to others to define, they're going to define it how they choose to define it. But if you have a very clear list of what's tier 1, tier 2, to Stu's point, giving a very clear NDC, it also makes it very auditable. I do want to be clear that we want to make sure that this is a low burden program. Adding add-on payments and modifiers and everything, it just adds to paperwork, electronic paperwork. But the other thing and I'm going to touch the third rail and throw the hand grenade, but the other thing I want to make sure we're not doing is creating a program that evolves into something that's like the current 340B program, where an entire industry has popped up around it, and there's controversy of whether it's achieving the goal that it was intended to achieve, and you're taking advantage of it, or you're abusing it. And so it needs to have guardrails in place ahead of time to make sure it's clearly defined, very black and white to follow. Because I really worry about what are the unintended consequences from some of these things. One of the other unintended consequences that came to mind is what are we doing to our friendshores who are, there's resilience now because there's 3 manufacturers of whatever the product is. Some of them are in Italy, some of them are in Mexico, some are in Canada, some are in the US. And now we're starting to consolidate the US market, and it might be threatening some of those others. And then we have some sort of catastrophe or other event. So, and that's where I think, Alan and the Civica models, but they don't encourage you to use their entire portfolio from their supply. They want you to diversify your portfolio with. So there are some unintended risks that could come with this. Sorry, Thomas, I know that wasn't your question, but they've been kind of stirring in my mind.
No, it's really helpful. And I think all of this discussion has really helped kind of elucidate some of the nuance here. And this is something that we thought about a lot when we were formulating our comment, was that I think there's an inherent balance between the simplicity and then the specificity and how much you can address every little balance of this system as you work through it. I'm sure that was a lot of fun for you, Ted. We're just about out of time. Any closing thoughts on your end here, Ted? We just went down the rest of the group.
Sure.
I can't say that I have a ton of experience being on panels and things like that, but with the number of people that were turning towards me and speaking directly to me, I don't know how things roll. But I understand it's about CMS and I have it on my name tag here. So it was a dangerous situation I brought in.
It's okay. It's almost happy hour. And I heard there's cocaine, chocolate, and
There's so many supply chain lessons to be learned right out there. Yes, I mean, I always, it's going to sound very broad, but I also understand that this is one of those times where people might be looking at being like, what might be coming down the line or something like that. The ANPRM, it being an advanced notice proposed rulemaking, does give me like at least a little bit of things to say, like there will be something to come of this, right? There is something, for those of you that wake up every morning and read the Federal Register with your morning coffee, which I know is probably an outsized proportion of people in this room. There will be something that will come down the line of this. I have read, for everybody that submitted comments on the rule, I've read them. And I appreciate hearing from all of you on these various things that you've raised, everything from having sort of outreach into various parts of the supply chain and things like, and also understanding the patient impact and understanding the influence that you can have at the site of care and things like that. Oftentimes at CMS, it's like hearing all of these wonderful ideas and then being like, okay, we have these various statutory authorities within which, and these frameworks within which we must operate. How can we sort of do the thing that makes the most sense and do the thing that, is at the very least helping people, right? That is the goal of it, and we understand that we are in sort of this position of being the largest payer out there, like as Alex spoke to before, it's over $1 trillion, on an annual basis. And I know that we're talking about the inpatient Medicare share, which is a smaller sort of pot of that. And then within that, we're also talking about sort of making these meaningful payments that would recognize additional costs that are intrinsic to domestic. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that I am hearing you. I am not necessarily able to comment, and respond to everything that you have said. And I recognize that that's sort of perhaps the frustrating part of speaking to someone who is, at the end of the day, in the bureaucracy. So thank you so much for bearing with me. But more to come, and very much look forward to engaging with everybody in the future.
Well, we appreciate you taking the hot seat. I'm sure a different experience than just reading the letters in your office. And thanks to the rest of the panel for sharing your expertise with us. Now I'll turn to Stephen for a quick closing before we get to Mike's reception afterward.
Yeah, just real quick to close. I have a lot of hope for what comes next and excitement for what comes next. I know a lot of you all do as well from what I heard. I think I imagine a world where we don't have shortages, where we can prevent shortages and where that's the norm and where taking care of patients is the norm. And I know a lot of you envision that world as well. I also imagine a world where Anna brings about 500 pounds of chocolate to our next event. Just chocolate though. And we talked about a lot of papers that we published. So you can go to our website here at healthpolicy.duke.edu/supply chain consortium or our event webpage and check those out, the event webpage that you used to register for today. And just looking forward to keeping working with all of you. And thank you so much again. Let's give another round of applause to all of you.